This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything. Oh, yeah.
Welcome to Special Edition, Episode 15 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Today's episode is just a live interview episode through one microphone. So just to let you know, the audio quality isn't perfect, but it's still not bad, and there's a lot of really good information exchanged. So without further ado, here's my interview with Clara and Tim Keyt. With the clean-cut Book of Mormon episode and 7.5 hours of history, there were some factual inaccuracies or misunderstandings that I reported about some very small details in history, and one of those that I wanted to focus on a lot was the War of 1812, because apparently I had a fairly fundamental misunderstanding about the War of 1812, and I want to correct that. So amidst quite a bit of research myself, I've invited on a couple of guests to help get us to some kind of understanding with the War of 1812, and then maybe we can draw some parallels to the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith through that. So joined with us today we have Clara Keyt.
Hi.
And Tim Keyt.
Hello, Bryce.
Hello. Thank you both for coming on. Let's kind of dive right in. What brings us here? How are you guys, I should say, qualified to talk on this? Because I am not whatsoever at all. So any qualifications are much, much better than none at all that I have.
I'm not a professional historian. However, I do have a master's degree in history, and one of the areas that I researched in that it was the Creek Indian War, and in particular one battle called Fort Mims. So Creek Indian War was part of the War of 1812.
Okay, very cool. So there's Native American history, basically, which is very, very paramount to the War of 1812. Some would argue that it was just included as, or it was, but I think listening to you talk on it, it seems like the arguments fall much more that it was kind of its own separate battle, as opposed to what was happening between the British and the Americans up in the North End.
I would guess that would be largely a point of view. I would say the Native Americans probably considered it their own little battle, where the European people, the American people, would consider it just part of the rest of the battle that or the rest of the war that they were participating in.
All right, fair enough. All right, Clara.
Yeah, so my name is Clara Keyt. I have a PhD in history, in American history. I'm an Americanist from Arizona State University. I graduated in 2010. I studied under Donald Fixico, who is, at this point, the premier Native American historian in the country. So I was very fortunate to study under him and to work under him for 4 years. I teach at Colorado State University in Fort Collins.
Very cool. Well, that's definitely some academic acumen that I'd like to play around with a little bit today. So let's talk about the War of 1812, because I think it was very, very important, much like us today who have lived through or, are experiencing the Iraq War and any wars beyond or before this. It's on everybody's mind to a certain extent. Everybody knows about it, knows some of the political games that are going on. So I think that was very important in Joseph Smith's mind. It was something I think that him and a lot of people that he was interacting with at all times were talking about. And, it was a very, I think, important war for Joseph Smith and for just America in general. And some of the reasons why were because of the pressures that were going on before that kind of brought about this war. So can we talk about that a little bit? Clara, would you like to start us out just talking about some of the pressures that were going on?
Yeah, so like so many wars, the War of 1812 was a continuation of the American Revolution, or as the British like to call it, the Transatlantic Civil War.
Okay.
When wars repeat in the same place, or the same nation, they're usually a result of unsettled business drawn up in the treaty for the previous war. And so just like many wars, just like Iraq 2.0, this is the Revolutionary War 2.0. When I think of the War of 1812, I think of 4 major reasons. And of course, there are lots of little stimuli and lots of little reasons. But these aren't in any particular order because they're all converging at the same time.
Right,
they're all happening at the same time from the time the Revolutionary War ends. The 1790s is a kind of a deep depression for the United States. So I want to skip ahead to about 1801. But in 1801, you start seeing a populist desire for expansion, meaning the common people are pushing over the Trans-Appalachian frontier. So those mountains act as a boundary. And after the recession is over in the early 1800s, people start pushing over that Appalachian frontier. And so you've got common people pushing for additional territory. Part of that is because plantation agriculture is booming. And cotton is everywhere. Tobacco is growing. But with cotton, which becomes a primary source of income for the South, you have to let a field lay fallow every 7 years. You have to choose another field. You can't keep harvesting the same field over and over because the soil becomes depleted. Cotton is very hard on soil. Mm-hmm. So the nutrients are drawn out and the soil essentially becomes worthless. So you've got to let it lay fallow for 7 years. So you've got to constantly move, especially if you are a child of a plantation owner. You need more land. Similar to what you see in New England, where the farms are broken up, and eventually Joseph Smith's dad, for instance, is traveling across New England in the same way that children of cotton farmers are traveling across the South because there's not enough land.
So that's what it was. I mean, I say this frequently is one of the only ways for the human race or any given population to survive is to expand to new territory and consume new resources. So that's what this was all born out of. They were over farming the land that they had, so they had to expand out and gain more land. Simple as that, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, kind of part 2 of cause number 1, there is an elite desire for control of ports. Mm-hmm. People need ports to ship their cotton and stuff elsewhere. And so they want to get control of ports. And so the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans becomes very important in that fight. And Spain currently, they owned the Port of New Orleans until 1801 when Napoleon took it back from them. But the problem is, even though you might be friendly with France, and they're kind of friendly, the U.S. is kind of in a quasi-war with France at this time, even though no formal declaration was made. Even if you're friends with Spain and France, who control the Port of New Orleans, you've got 110 miles between the Port of New Orleans and open waters in the Gulf of Mexico. That 110 miles is very foggy. It's very difficult to see. And it makes great places to hide out if you are a British pirate and you want to take American stuff.
Mm-hmm. And impress the sailors, right?
Yeah. So with impression, that usually up until about 1808, 1809, impressment happened in either foreign ports or on the high seas.
Okay. So just for clarification's sake, impressment is any given ship that it just takes over another ship and takes some of their crew for themselves, basically, for in layman's terms, right? Or some version of Shanghai people into be sailors for you.
That's correct. Okay. Yeah. And so Britain viewed the treaty of this transatlantic civil war, which is my favorite way to describe the Revolutionary War. They viewed it as sort of a truce, a temporary halt. Mm-hmm. And they kind of still viewed America as a colonial dependent. And so they viewed it as their right to impress sailors.
And I remember in a fair amount of my studying here, when they would board a ship, for example, the Chesapeake, which is one that we'll talk about as one of the catalysts for the actual war, they would seek out the soldiers that had a British accent, and they would snag them up first. And, if they needed any more beyond that, then they would take some Americans. But, I mean, for the most part, they were just taking people that were, at some point, British citizens before that. So I think that kind of played farther into them feeling like it was their right to impress these soldiers.
Absolutely. And the British soldiers knew when they jumped ship, when they deserted, that they could go to American ports and they would be safe by and large, that Americans weren't going to force them to go back to Britain. And so they would use that excuse of, we think that you have some of our sailors, you're harboring runaways, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we have the right to do that.
And the reason why Britain was doing this in the first place was because they were running out. I mean, the war with Napoleon was so resource demanding on Britain, and that really played into Americans' favor, at least for the first half of the war. I mean, Britain was quite distracted, and that's why they were needing more ships and they were needing more soldiers and sailors, because they were all dying. They were all getting killed by Napoleon's forces. So
absolutely. And so that movement, that first cause of what I call expansionist pressure, it was a combination of common people moving and elite people wanting control of the ports. There was a group called the Southern Warhawks, and they were the most vocal proponents of war. The Southern Warhawks were elite plantation owners who owned, hundreds of acres. And they were calling for outright war to get these British ships to stop seizing their cotton and to stop taking their military soldiers. So, and that largely happens in the South.
One aspect, I believe, also going into this with the different viewpoints of England having a perspective of their right, of England having a perspective of who their citizens were. America had just won the Revolutionary War. They had the thoughts that they were independent, which contrasted with the English viewpoint. Where Clara's talking about the Southern Warhawks. Some of the areas, in particular, like along the Gulf Coast, Pensacola is a good example of this. It's called the City of Five Flags. It had been first settled by the Spanish, and it continually changed. It went from the Spanish to the French, and to the Spanish, and the English, and back to the Spanish. Changing back and forth between the different countries. And as it changed, some of the people would stay, large portions would leave. And an additional item is going along the southern boundaries, the Gulf Coast, which would be the northern rim of the Caribbean, is the countries would leave a settlement there. They would set up a fort or a settlement and may return, may restock them, may be late. Those people, those areas weren't necessarily their priorities. So the mentioning of Pensacola, well, when hard times come, when they get hit by a hurricane or their resupply ships don't show up, their nearest neighbors are Mobile or New Orleans.
Which were, at the time, both of those were under American control, right?
There's various times, so it's kind of a fluid thing. For the most part, most of the historical time period up until, where we're talking about now with the English, New Orleans was predominantly French. And so a lot of the times, especially with the Spanish and the French, they were at war or undeclared war. Well, these settlements, these forts that are kind of on their own, they started having close relationships and cooperating between each other, even when their own countries were at war. So they're starting to lose some of their national pride and associating with who's right there close. So just point is being across the Atlantic from these European nations, there was a lot of losing of their national pride of what country they're supposed to be a citizen of.
Right, or just their identity in general. They were just becoming Pensacola's, right, or New Orleans. That's all that they were, because if you're identifying yourself as a British or a French colony and you're not getting supplied by them, you're just being forgotten by them. Right. It's hard to identify yourself with them.
Sorry to overtalk you.
Yeah.
But yes, I think when the resupply is not happening, and there's no communication. Well, Book of Mormon has examples of this, of being at war and not receiving resupply and starting to question your own country of they are not sustaining you, and why are you supposed to continue to follow and be a subject of this country that is not supporting and taking care of you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's fair. That makes a lot of sense. I was going to say something out of ignorance, but I'll leave it aside.
Just throw one more thing out. Clara's much more knowledgeable on this stuff, so just one additional item before letting her continue is that at times, like Spain in particular, as well as others, the people that they sent to populate an area, to settle an area, weren't necessarily their most upstanding citizens. Many of them had a choice of going to Florida or going to prison.
Oh, okay.
So Florida with Disneyland, that's largely post-air conditioning. It wasn't as glamorous until there's options of seeking shelter from the sun and the humidity and
the swamp areas and all that makes sense. As either go to hell or go on to high waters. Either one, right? Okay. Clara, you want to weigh in on?
Yeah, I will just say that when some colonies are or feel abandoned by their mother country, sometimes they do break away, but very often, and just as often, it results in pushback. They feel that the mother country owes them, particularly with Britain, that the mother country owes them some form of caregiving, that they have rights under, the 1688 Constitution of Britain. Of course, that goes back to the one of the causes of the Revolutionary War, but very often they don't just break away and create their own country. They demand that the mother country take care of them,
which is understandable, especially if they're paying taxes to that country.
That's
it's
exactly
like
right.
we're part of we're not a sovereign nation taking care of ourselves. We're dependent on you, and you're dependent on our taxes.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
For clarification, I wasn't necessarily talking about the breaking off and changing their flag. but to some degree more of, under times of hardship, cooperating with the other forts that were relatively close. So yes, it wasn't necessarily we're Spanish now or completely bailing out.
Okay. Very interesting. It was a lot more gray than that. It wasn't so black and white defined. It was much more.
It's always gray. Right.
Okay. It's always gray. Fair enough. So let's get on to some of the other pressures. Expansionism was one of the big pressures, right?
Right.
Americans were trying to overstep their boundaries more or less.
Right. The second one has a much more clear date. So we've got some economic sanctions that are put into place against Britain, and they completely fail. Again, because Britain isn't respecting America as a new nation, so to speak. So in 1803, of course, Louisiana Purchase had occurred, but Britain and France start fighting again. They resume their wars in the Caribbean. They're always fighting. And they resume their wars in the Caribbean.
Well, this is when Napoleon was really starting to hit his stride, right?
Right.
Okay.
And very often warships from both countries would appear off the coast of Florida and the southern states. And
they're like, what's going on out there? What are you guys doing here?
And once again, the U.S. gets dragged in the middle of their war. And so in this war between Britain and France, and it carries over to the Caribbean, Britain starts seizing American ships traveling to the European continent. And they're trying to confiscate supplies so that France doesn't get them.
Of course.
Right. So America has Jay's Treaty, which gives them preeminent trade with Britain, but they're also trading with France.
Well, because, America has done this in a lot of times. World War I and II was a very, very shining example of we like to just sit back and let people duke it out and then profit off of it.
That's exactly
Selling
right.
lots of stuff.
That's exactly right. So even though a third of all American ships were being confiscated, they were making a ton of money.
A third.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
But they were making so much money that they were still playing both sides. And it works okay. It's a field day for American merchants because they're jacking up.
And it explodes the American economy too.
Right.
Because we're making all this money. We're pulling in all these resources, shipping out all of these goods. That we can't help but to pull out of the depression that was rife throughout the 1790s that you spoke about earlier, because all of this new cool stuff was happening and everybody's getting richer, and it's the roaring 20s, only it was the roaring O's. 18 O's.
War can be very good for the economy if other factors are in place, and it works for about 5 years. Everybody is feeling great. And then in 1806, the Chesapeake incident occurs.
Okay. So let's talk about the Chesapeake, because I know that a lot of Americans hang their hat on it. This was basically the declaration of war, the informal declaration of war by Britain, right?
Yeah. And the fact that it took several years more to actually officially declare war on Britain is kind of amazing, because it was such a significant incident. So in 1806, there were two French ships that come into the Norfolk Harbor, Norfolk, Virginia. They were kind of limping in. They had been severely damaged by hurricanes in, I believe, the Caribbean. I'm not exactly sure where, but the Sybil and the Patriot, they come kind of limping into the Norfolk Harbor for repairs. It's a friendly harbor, so they know that they can get repairs there. And the British ship Leopard is following them. And the French ships go into port, and the Leopard blocks the bay, so they can't get out. And while they're hanging out, waiting for the French ships to leave so they can attack them again, they apparently decide that it's a little bit too long of a wait to just hang out and do nothing. So they decide to investigate the American ship, the Chesapeake. And so
investigate, that seems like that's an operative word.
It is an operative word. And different sides have different views of this. The British give orders to the captain of the Chesapeake and sort of a search warrant.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that some deserters are on the Chesapeake, right?
Which is that's a reasonable assumption given what the impressment that they've done up until this point.
Right,
I mean,
right.
Given any random search on any random ship, they were probably bound to find at least 1 or 2 deserters.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, they find 3 or 4.
Okay.
I think it might be 4. Maybe I should check. But 3 or 4. 3 Americans are killed in the process. So there's a little skirmish. 3 Americans get killed. 3 or 4 deserters are found. One of them gets hanged right off the ship.
Wow, okay.
The Leopard. They take care of him right away, and the other 3 are taken under duress, of course. So, and there's a lot of details in that I don't know.
Well, we could probably spend an entire episode just talking about the boarding of the Chesapeake.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, we have the details of it for more or less.
But the significance of that is that in the past, British soldiers were impressing about 1,000 people per year. British ships were taking about 1,000 people per year.
That's a lot.
By the time the War of 1812 had started, you have about 6,000 American sailors who have been impressed into British service.
Like, we didn't sign up for this. I don't like this.
Exactly. Okay. But most of the time it was happening in foreign ports. Foreign ports were really dangerous for American sailors, or on the high seas. But now it had happened right in an American port. An American ship was docked at an American port, and the British came and essentially kidnapped 3 or 4 people off their ship. That's the difference. That's the significance. It's quite humiliating for Americans. They see this forced boarding and this forced skirmish as a challenge to American national honor. We're moving into the cult of honor at this point, which we can talk about.
It's just nationalism, right? Patriotism at a certain level.
That's part of it for sure. A belief that if someone challenges you, then you have the right to challenge them physically, to uphold your honor, particularly strong in the South. And it is in Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia. And so it's really humiliating for American national honor. And so Americans start demanding this physical response. They are calling for a declaration of war against Britain. Thomas Jefferson calms everybody down. He manages to diplomatically try to diffuse the situation, but Congress feels that they need to make Britain see that this is a legitimate country. And so it passes a law called the Embargo Act of 1907. And what this law does is that it prevents British ships from coming to American ports, and it prevents American ships from going to foreign ports, but it also passes a law that prevents, or that's supposed to prevent sailors from being forced into the British Navy, because, kidnappers always follow laws. And so...
Well, I think it was just setting out the law. They drew a line in the sand, right? It's like, this is what we're sick of what's been happening, so we're making a law that makes it so what you're doing is in violation and is basically a declaration of war.
Exactly. And the premise of the embargo... and it goes beyond that impressment. It prevents, it essentially halts trade with Britain. And so the idea, the premise of it was that Britain had become so dependent on American goods and raw materials that it would be forced to recognize America as a legitimate country.
Or it would just go back to war with them and force them to give them the goods.
Perhaps. Okay. Yeah, perhaps. And it's not that that's a wrong assumption, but like so many of these laws do, the wealthy people, so the top businesses just kind of jacked up their prices. The people that felt the pains first were the common people, the populace.
Of course.
Both in Britain and America. Textile workers, obviously slaves, servants. The people who wielded power really didn't feel the Embargo Act very much. And so trade stops. everyone is suffering. The U.S. manufacturing companies had the U.S. market all to themselves now, but everyone else was crippled. And so there's a great fear that this embargo act is going to kick off another recession, like the one in the 1790s.
Well, when you take out half of where your trade income is coming from, when you make it illegal to trade with them, that's almost to be expected. I mean, if we were to have gone the other way, if the French were to have boarded the Chesapeake, I mean, of course they were. This is nothing but a hypothetical, but I mean, we would probably pass that embargo act to stop trading with the French and then go back to supporting the British altogether. I mean, of course, that's nothing but a hypothetical. Given the situation leading up to that, that's completely implausible. That would never have happened. But I mean, it's it basically vilifies whoever violates this or whoever this embargo act was put to be a problem for, which was the Britain at the time.
A quick point with the boarding of the Chesapeake. Organizations many times go through a fairly set pattern of growth, of going through significant characteristics, and a lot of times a point in an organization can be called the Age of Heroes. And so whether it's a company or a country, you go through a pattern. And this Age of Heroes, rather than necessarily being a bureaucratic time period where things are set, policies are established, and all you do is follow through with the directive, there's a time period that when a problem pops up, a hero appears and handles it in some way, shape, or form. So a quick example is George Washington. And, we've kind of glorified him and his war capabilities and everything as general, that you have enough successes and that he became a national point of pride, became the first president of the country.
And was that same kind of thing happening with Jefferson at this point?
Well, I don't think so with Jefferson. However, with the Chesapeake selling out a harbor was foolish. It made no sense. It was not for the good of the country or the actions of the Chesapeake were rather foolish. It appears that the captain was looking for a bit of his opportunity to be a hero. Just prior to the Chesapeake, I believe it was the night before, in darkness, a different ship slipped out, went, past the British and was on his way. You have other ships that stayed in harbor and didn't go out, and to some degree, the Chesapeake, rather than being captured and boarded, challenged. It was almost like a strutting out to sea and confronting the British. So just point being is, I see an aspect of the Age of Heroes of having an opportunity to leave your mark. And
well, we see how it turned out. The Chesapeake got boarded, and they, however this skirmish turned out, the Chesapeake was definitely not the winner.
Right. So with this, if a lucky cannon shot could have changed all that, and this unknown captain that don't know who he was, don't care, may have been the next president.
Interesting. Just small details like that. There's so much contingent on those. I love stuff like that. Just the foolish actions of the Chesapeake, the way you put it. That's you wonder how many conflicts have been started throughout our history just by one guy thinking that he can be the next hero, be the next John Wayne or something. So,
which a quick caution in there also is we really can't say that this was his thoughts.
Well, fair enough.
You know,
it's speculation.
Within history, we can speculate. We can come up with some assumptions. However, do we actually know that this was the step in running for president? No. We don't. We can't say we know what his thoughts are.
Okay.
There's really kind of a bold move that, in hindsight, didn't make much sense.
Well, we saw. I think we'll probably get to this later, but with William Henry Harrison, we see him trying to set himself apart as the Mr. Hero to get elected as ninth president, I believe it was. And that was with the death of Tecumseh. But, I mean, we'll talk about that later. So
Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, well, Andrew Jackson. Yes, we will definitely get into him. So, okay, so let's conclude the pressures that basically started this. We had the Chesapeake that happened.
So that embargo act lasted less than a year. Macon's Bill number 2 is what opens up trade again between Britain and the U.S., between France and the U.S. And once again, Britain starts seizing ships. And so it appears that the only way that we can get Britain to stop seizing ships is to declare war. And so the Southern Warhawks, once again, are being very vocal in their call for war. With Britain continuing to seize American ships and to interfere with American trade, Americans had just fought an 8-year war over this, right? Mm-hmm. And so here they are again. And it looks like war is going to be the only way to get Britain to recognize them. An interesting fact is that France was seizing just as many ships going to Britain as Britain was going to France.
I didn't know that. I thought it was more one side. I thought it was all Britain was doing this. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So, but it all depends on where's your national income coming from?
Right.
Right, Britain.
And also
we had Day's Treaty, which gave preeminent trade to Britain. So.
Okay. Fair enough. And also maybe what was, if war is declared, what's the most impending threat? Is it the small French colonies down in New Orleans at the time, or some of the other Spanish colonies, or is it the British-controlled Canadian colonies? Which I know that was a very big point of contention throughout the whole War of 1812.
Yeah, it was. So the third cause, and Tim will take over here, but just to give some context, is there's this widespread belief that Britain is supporting the pan-Indian movement in America.
I've never heard that phrase, pan-Indian movement.
So that means pan-Indian, we see that develop among a number of groups in the U.S., pan-Africanism, etc. It is unifying together against your common oppressor.
Oh, okay.
Right. So putting loyalty to your ethnicity above loyalty to a specific tribe in order to overcome oppression.
Okay, right. And thus rises Tecumseh and some other leaders.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Tim. Let's hear your take in on this.
I wanted to just give some context for that. No? Okay, go ahead.
This is a joke. Please continue.
Okay. Well, so because of the Louisiana Purchase, settlers were pouring over that Trans-Appalachian frontier, like I mentioned.
Right.
So in 30 years, you've got 1 million people living west of the Appalachian Mountains, which is new.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure the natives were like, what is going on here? This is where we were given our land. This is where you guys said you would stop. What's going on here?
That is absolutely correct. Prior to the War of 1812, Americans were very interested in removing Indians, but they were interested in consolidating them,
right?
Rather than forcing them to just completely leave.
Or eradication.
Correct.
All right, let's be clear. Yeah. Most of it happened through just blatant eradication.
That is
horrible.
That is correct.
So, okay.
I didn't know how much you wanted to go into that.
Yeah, let's get Tim's take on that part of the pressure, because I know that's kind of where you're itching to get in on this.
Okay. Yes. Thinking about some of the significance of the War of 1812, there's a lot of national significance, a lot of change that. Or a lot of ramifications of instances or different perspectives that change the nation, change the communities. However, there's also that same thing of changing individuals. Now, I grew up in the West, in the Rocky Mountain area, and we have a tendency to think we are our own person. Clara, on the other hand, grew up in the South, and there's much more of a community perspective. One of the areas that Clara specializes in is having a sense of place, of how a place, how a culture, things around you help shape you. In the West, we have a tendency to think we're on our own, we're our own man. Mm-hmm. And so with it's kind of interesting in that is a thing of the area around us where we're at, our community, that tells us that. So this sense of place that shapes us tells us that we're not shaped. It's kind of a convoluted perspective of us thinking we're our own man proves the point. But just what I'm wanting to get at here is these things that are happening in the country change individuals as well as the nation, the government, the community. So putting a little perspective on this of Joseph Smith. So we have the War of 1812 as there's things that led up to it, as it's a continuation of the Revolutionary War. That number is may not be as significant as it sounds, of 1812. It's not a set start of the war. However, 1812 was roughly the year, 1812, 1813, that Joseph Smith had his leg surgery. So,
yeah, that's true.
The aspect of that is Joseph Smith was having a problem. He had an infection inside the bone marrow, I believe, and they took a chip out of his leg. So he was laid up for a period of time. His brothers had to carry him around, just so this young boy was taken out of commission where he wasn't helping out his family. And you've covered this previously, but he became a detriment to his family. So while he's laying there, we have stories from his mother of how he would start making up stories and entertain the family. So they would come out in after working in the fields, and he would entertain them with stories. A lot of those stories were Native American that mingled his family members in with. So what I'm getting at here is a lot of times within the LDS church, they talk about how he was so uneducated and everything. He went to school hit and miss at times, which was extremely common. To some degree, his formal schooling was probably above average.
Well, and also being laid up, he didn't have to go out in the fields like his older brothers did. He didn't have to go do physical labor like a lot of the family was doing. So what else was he going to do other than sit home, heal his leg, and read stuff? Correct.
Now, how much he read, how much books, they were pretty poor. I don't know. But yeah, I can imagine maybe books coming by, being dropped off, people coming by and telling him stories, or newspapers.
Or just when he does go to school, maybe stealing a textbook or something from the school, which that's what the late War of 1812 was, the late war between Great Britain and the United States. I mean, and we've seen the parallels between it and the Book of Mormon, so I mean, I think that's very important. I think just with them being as poor as they were, they probably got, whenever Joseph did get his hands on a new book, he probably scoured it and read it over and over and over because he probably read everything else in the house. So I can only imagine that if at some point he got a hold of that textbook written in the scriptural style talking about the War of 1812, I can only imagine that he devoured it. Yes. He couldn't get enough of it. He couldn't soak it up enough because it was during this time that he was starting to identify who he was. He's starting to come into his, young adulthood, young teenagehood, I guess I should say. And you're starting to discover who you are and what your thoughts are on things. And, what else would he want to study other than the biggest war that was going on in the country that he was living in? And I mean, some of the pressures, like burning down the White House, and I mean, some of the big things that happened, the invasion of the Chesapeake, they must have had some sort of effect on him personally, where he must have felt a lack of security that we don't necessarily have to deal with today as Americans.
And that kind of brings up another, and I'd love to hear your perspective on how this fits in with his early life and development of the Mormon tradition. In 1811, there was a significant Indian incident as well, the Battle of Tippecanoe.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling it might play into the Book of Mormon somehow. So I'd love to hear your perspective on it. So you've got that message of pan-Indianism, stop white encroachment onto Indian lands. We're putting any loyalties to your specific tribe below that of ensuring total Indian survival. So everyone's coming together, right? So Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, they gather everyone at a place called...
Hang on. You just threw those out there, and we talked about it before starting recording. Enlighten us a little bit at Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh. Who are these guys?
So they are the leaders of... the pan-Indian movement between the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast. They are recruiting tribes in the Ohio Valley and the Upper South. They're going among the Muskogee Creek Indians in Alabama.
So this is what they were doing was, although these different Native American tribes were not, they may have been allies, they may have been enemies at some point, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa was going around and saying, hey, we got these Americans that are really starting to push in on our territory, and pretty soon, I mean, how long is it going to be before we don't have anything left? So let's band together. So I'm kind of wanting to get, Tim, a little bit of your perspective on this Tenskwatawa guy and Tecumseh.
Sure. A little bit of background on they come from the Shawnee nation. Shawnee, a group of tribes from the northeast, pushing the areas of New York, going clear down into Alabama. And I believe they did a lot of mobility, traveling up and down. They didn't necessarily possess that entire land. But it's thought that they may have been descendants from the mound builders, which Joseph Smith found significant, thinking that his backyard, the hill behind his house, was a native mound. Mm-hmm. So with these Shawnee, they participated in a few wars. They were involved in the Beaver Wars. They also, initially, they were with the French. They were allied with the French, and then changed sides where they became allies with England. And that continued on through the Revolutionary War, to where they were allies with England against what became the United States. So this is the nation, the Native American nation that, I'm sorry, could you pronounce the name?
Tenskwatawa.
Tenskwatawa. He's also known as the prophet. So I will go with the prophet because I can pronounce that.
The prophet, I think. Who was he designated the prophet as? Was it Tecumseh? Was it the people that were following him? And what made him the prophet?
Yes.
I'm so curious.
He became known as the prophet. Well, it goes back to, there was a chief that died for unknown reason. It was probably influenza, could have been smallpox, but this chief died. And it was kind of a mystery to the Native Americans of what happened to him, whether it was a blanket was given to him or, and It was thought by those around him that this was witchcraft.
Okay.
That he was taken out by witchcraft. And just a quick stop and think about that. He's given I don't know how he got infected, but you're given a blanket and next thing you know, you're sick. That without understanding of germs and germ warfare, witchcraft is a logical assumption.
Right, and it could have even been, this is a swamp area. It could have been a mosquito.
So whether it happened that way, he got sick and died. It was assumed that this was witchcraft. And it led to a Native American witch hunt. They started hunting down witches and killing them.
No shit.
And,
like the Salem witch trials,
yes.
only the Native Americans.
And what was that name one more time?
Tenskwatawa
excelled at hunting down witches, and thus he became known as the prophet.
Whoa.
And his prophecies started extending beyond being a witch hunter. He started having prophecies from the Great Spirit. The Great Spirit would tell him to separate the Native Americans should go back to their Native American religion and separate themselves from the Europeans. And this became a Native American revival.
So was that something that a lot of Americans at the time would have known about? This guy that was
it became
trying
known to him.
Okay, so it wasn't just something that was happening just isolated over here on the the western side of the American Indian border.
With the prophet, it probably would have been a little less known than we will get to with Tecumseh.
Okay.
So with him, he largely started getting pushed out. He caught enough attention that he moved west. He moved to Ohio and started his own community. It was called Prophet Town. And the Pan-American movement, the Pan-Indian, yes, that's what I meant. Sorry. The Pan-Indian movement. So Pan means across. So multiple Indians from multiple tribes started coming together in Prophet Town. He ended up with 3,000 or more Native Americans from at least 10 different, significantly different tribes coming together in Ohio.
That can be seen as, there's probably men, women, and children, but that can be seen as a fairly large army. That's a large commune, a large contingency of people to try and clash against.
That's exactly what Governor Harrison thought of it as. They had actually gathered at Prophetstown, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, and their following had gathered at Prophetstown to try to get the American government to uphold the Treaty of Greenville, which was in 1795, which basically just said that the U.S. promises not to take any future land unless it has the approval of 100% of the entire tribe. And of course, like all Native treaties go, they're broken immediately. Oh, yeah. You've got 1 million people in 30 years.
1 million people.
1 million European Americans taking
moving over
the old Northwest. Line. Yeah, what we call the old Northwest. Wow. And so hang on. Just going back just briefly about Tenskwatawa and him being the prophet, trying to go back to the native roots. I think that might be something that kind of played into maybe Joseph Smith's mindset. Hey, if these people are looking for their roots, they're looking for their history. Why don't I give it to them?
So you find a comparison about going and establishing basically a commune and bringing people. Joseph Smith did that?
Multiple times, yes. And initially.
Yes, there's clearly a parallel, I agree.
Yeah, and I think what the Book of Mormon was initially made for was maybe Joseph Smith was seeing these tribes were cropping up, and he's thinking, if I can come up with one holy book that they can all unite around, one history of them that they can all identify with, they can all share a common idea and value with, they will all follow Joseph.
That's an interesting aspect, yes.
The white prophet, the white leader.
Joseph assuming the title of prophet, where did that come from? I don't know. In the LDS Church, we like to think it came from the Old Testament, that it's a continuation, the one true church, blah, blah, blah.
But a lot of people were calling themselves prophets in that day, though. A lot of people were doing it. I mean, even people that were breaking off, like the woman Hubble that was in Kirtland, she called herself a prophetess. I mean, people were calling themselves prophets all the time.
Very true.
So,
an aspect of Joseph Smith that I kind of see is that the Book of Mormon, you've emphasized pretty clearly how Joseph Smith has taken pieces and parts and brought them all together. Mm-hmm. I think of him as like the great compiler of pulling pieces here and there and putting them together like a puzzle. Mm-hmm. It seems to me, to some degree, not only writing a book, but he did this for his life of, as you talk to the young lady, with a psychology background, studying graduate studies in psychology of addressing the characteristics of Joseph Smith, it seems to me one of the items is seeing people and saying, I want to be that. Mm-hmm. And whether it's the prophet. Okay, so moving on from the prophet, there was Tecumseh, who was the brother of the prophet, who became identified as the community leader. A lot of that was because he was more of the warrior, where his brother was more of the spiritual leader.
So I've studied a few parallels in the Book of Mormon and the war here, and that we're going to be getting to very soon. But that was something that you just triggered something in my mind, and I would assume that other Mormon listeners would think of, well, in that case, it might be the Jaredites. Think about the Jaredites and what happened with them. They kind of went through this mass exodus. They went across the Great Waters. Maybe that could be an analog for like the Mississippi or something. They were following the spiritual leader that had a brother that was more of the actor, the guy that was kind of doing everything, much like Aaron was with Moses. So I can see that there being a parallel there with Mohan Raimori Yankumer and Tenska-Wadawa or something.
There's so many places we could go, and to some degree they're probably all accurate. With the Jaredites of Joseph Smith looking at things around him, with the War of 1812, there was an attempted use of a submarine. Mm-hmm. It went nowhere. It wasn't much of a submarine, but it was during a process of time that they were developing submarines, and you have the tight like a dish vessels of the Jaredites. And he's seeing a not magical, but a God-inspired invention of these submarines that are in the process of being developed. They're attempting to use them. There was one called the Turtle that during the Revolutionary War shaped something like a seer stone, egg-shaped, that was attempted to be used as an American vessel, attempted
underwater
to be used. Vessel. Yes. Now,
that's amazing.
It attacked English ship, and it's a mystery what happened. The English were unaware they were attacked.
Right.
So not only did they not see it coming, there was no ramifications. So
who knows? But
you can see him
still existed,
reaching through, grabbing something, and utilizing it. Mm-hmm. Within ships, there's these jewel type, these jewels that are about 3 to 4 inches across, that they would bore holes in the deck and put these jewels in. The light would hit and it would
scatter the light.
Yeah, so below deck.
Holy crap! Really?
Yes, you have these. I believe it's called a deck prism or something like that. So these prisms, the natural light would hit and would shine and light up beneath the deck.
That's so amazing. That's exactly jaredite.
Rather than just a hole that lets water in, it was fairly, sealed. Just like, talking about the tight like a dish. So you have these little jewels with the jaredites, God magically made them light up. Well, this is a natural aspect that, so where did Joseph Smith come up with this word? I don't know. Did he know about this?
He was the great compiler. Right.
Not going with an ancient alien type of, where you have someone that has very minor knowledge that starts becoming the authority saying, obviously aliens built the temple, not shooting for that.
Right.
But
these are things that we know existed. They were probably talked about by a lot of people in newspaper articles, in just rumors, word of mouth, in textbooks like the Late War of 1812. And Joseph very possibly could have come upon that knowledge and said, I want to put that in my own book.
Taking technology and giving it a spiritual meaning.
Yeah. Wow. So, there you go. Wow. That's amazing. So, Clara, let's move on into the war and what finally, I mean, I know we said 1812 wasn't really a hard date for when the war started, but when did it actually kind of kick off when it was declared a war between the two states?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I will say that the pressures built up more in 1811 with the Battle of Tippecanoe.
Mm-hmm. Battle of Tippecanoe was Tecumseh.
Yeah. So I saw the Battle of Tippecanoe in researching, and I know that it was a big pressure, but I didn't look into it quite enough. I was hoping to get a little bit of enlightenment because I know it was one of the main contingent battles.
Yeah. So Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa were gathered there in Prophetstown, which is outside Lafayette, Indiana. They had a few thousand people there, and they had gathered to try to petition the United States and Governor Harrison to honor the Treaty of Greenville from 1795, which says you're not going to take any more of our land unless the whole tribe agrees. And it was supposed to be a peaceful gathering. And the records from the Native American side indicate that it was a peaceful gathering. Governor Harrison didn't buy it. He felt quite threatened by several thousand Native American people gathered outside his town.
Like you would.
Yeah. And so November 1811, he takes 1,000 men and he marches on to Prophetstown. And
wow. And this was basically unprovoked.
Correct.
They were just gathered there. That was one of the gathering places, all the people that were following Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh.
Correct.
And he's like, I don't like this because this is the makings of a fortification of a point of war. Right.
So it's kind of unprovoked. They're marching towards Prophetstown and they make camp. 'Cause it takes a little bit of time to get there. They make camp. Indians, the Pan Indians see that they're marching toward them, and they take action. They take preemptive action and attack Harrison's camp. Harrison responds by burning the entire Prophetstown to the ground.
Holy crap.
Yeah,
okay.
Called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And so he needed to explain, Governor Harrison needed to issue a report. They would issue reports after incidences of why he burnt the entire town to the ground, stole 5,000 bushels of corn, ransacked everything of value, and killed 50 Indians.
Looted.
Oh, yeah. So what is it that would prompt Harrison to start sort of this semi-unprovoked attack? And so he releases this document saying that the Indians are rabid and vicious, right?
Oh, of course.
Rabid and vicious, but it's the British that instigated this Indian rebellion.
What? They weren't even there, were they? Or I mean, well, the British they were probably pro Pan-Indian.
They
I would
were.
assume, because the Pan-Indians pose the greatest threat on the western side to the Americans. But I can't imagine, like, where did they come into the equation here?
So the British, since the Revolutionary War, would supply Indians with guns and war supplies.
Okay.
Right.
There we go.
This is in the Old Northwest, which is still being fought over, right? Technically, it's supposed to be an American territory, but British aren't really honoring that. And the British claim it as part of Canada. So the Old Northwest is Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, that area, the Great Lakes region.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very easy to point the finger at the British. We've got all these other reasons that the U.S. is feeling very threatened by Britain. Mm-hmm. And so the British make sort of a convenient scapegoat to point the finger at for the Battle of Tippecanoe. But they were, in fact, supplying Indians to win back their lost colonies.
Well, I mean, we've done that. A lot of nations have done that. Try to use a proxy army. I mean, we talked about this World War I and World War II, and in Syria, same kind of thing.
Exactly.
Just use a proxy army to fight your battles for you. Here's some guns. Here, go kill our enemies for us.
That's exactly it. Okay. And the U.S. does that as well.
Well, exactly. Nobody is. Everybody does that
Indians
to a certain extent.
Are the pawns, and
I think that's one recurring theme we can get out of the entire discussion is the Indians kind of got screwed. Simple as that. Altogether.
They end up being the biggest losers of the War of 1812.
Yeah, without any real declared victor in any instance. So, okay, let's move on to Tecumseh and what he was doing with organizing these Pan-Indians and, being basically their one military leader that they could all band underneath, right?
Sure. The area of Tecumseh that I'm most familiar with is going down south. Mm-hmm. And so with the large swath of area that he held influence, down getting into the area of Alabama and Georgia, Tecumseh, he gathered a following that several significant leaders started paying attention to him, started following him, and they became, or several of them became significant religious leaders themselves. There's a couple names such as High Head Jim. He became a religious leader in the area. There's also Josiah Francis, Patty Walsh, Peter McQueen.
Those aren't Native American names.
And just a couple weeks ago, I believe you talked about a Chief Anderson.
Yes.
So, yes, that's a very common thing, that a lot of these Native Americans were not fully Native American. They had some European blood. A significant portion of that is Scotch-Irish. There's books written that talk about the Scots in particular of coming over to the United States as part of Great Britain and relating to the Native Americans more than to the English or the various other Europeans. And this is a quick example of where a lot of the Scotch-Irish and the Native American started forming families, and especially a lot of the Scottish becoming very closely associated with the Native Americans.
So these leaders that you listed off, McQueen, Walsh, Francis, I mean, you said religious leaders, but they kind of doubled as part of like a pan-Indian government as well, right? They weren't just the spiritual leaders, they were the political leaders as well.
To some degree, but there was also other leaders that you might consider more the warrior side, such as there was William Weatherford. He was a significant leader. He was also known as Red Eagle. There was William McIntosh. William McGillivray, they became significant in the Creek Indian War. And with Tecumseh going down into the area and then these Creek Indians taking it a step farther, this portion of the War of 1812 became the Creek Indian War. So it goes by various names, but it can be considered part of the War of 1812 or offshoot of it.
And that, you even said that it's kind of a matter of perspective, right? Because, yes. I mean, a lot of Native Americans would say that this, or well, a lot of historians in general, I would assume, would say, yes, this was a war in and of itself, standalone. It didn't necessarily have a whole lot of, it wasn't so much affected by what was going on the East Coast and down in New Orleans, and it was more isolated than that. Is that correct?
I would say so. With that, you had a national policy of pushing the Native Americans off their land, sending them west, even perspectives of they're going to die. Let's get them off our streets. This is
the Trail of Tears happened around this time too.
Yes, of moving them out.
1830s.
That was 1830. So
which,
okay,
it came significantly later, but it was like the beginning of what became the Trail of Tears and the different aspects of that. And so the Creek Indian, for some reason, they didn't want to give up their land. Mm-hmm. The policy was
those sticklers.
Yes, I don't know what was wrong with them. But by the way, listeners, that's sarcasm. So, with that, the Creek Nation started dividing up. Those names that I read off with the religious leaders, it became a religious item in that there was this comet on the order of Halley's Comet. So there's this comet that went across the sky that was visible for weeks. And Tecumseh started talking about how this was a message from the Great Spirit to go back to your Native American ways, to drive the Europeans off the land.
Okay.
There was an earthquake. The Great Spirit's talking to him. The Great Spirit's getting serious. When the earth starts shaking, listen. That Native American revival that we talked went down into the South and divided up the Creek Nation into two parts. There was the Upper Creek and the Lower Creek. Largely, they came up with two different philosophies of how they were going to keep their land. Mm-hmm. The Lower Creek had a pretty good relationship with the federal government Indian agent in the area, to where they kept their lands. They integrated largely with the European population. They had plantations, they had slaves, and their hope to maintain their land was to become European, to become white and delightsome.
Well, it's almost like they saw the writing on the wall at this point, because they had seen how much Europeans had expanded before now. And I would assume they're like, well, it's not going to stop anytime soon, so what are we going to do? Are we going to oppose and fall and die like so many of our brethren have? Or are we just going to accept it and just go the European way?
The Upper Creek saw the writing on the wall as well. They just came up with a different method of dealing with it. Their method was
combat.
To drive the Europeans off their land. And part of that was to go back to the Native American way. Now, let's discuss that a little bit. Early on in the war, there was a settler woman, American woman, that was taken captive. She was taken to Pensacola, which was Spanish, and she was traded for arms. The Native Americans headed back home. It was led by McQueen and High Head Jim that we already discussed. They were headed back home with rifles that they had traded this lady for. And they were met at a place called Burnt Corn. So there was the Battle of Burnt Corn, where most of the Native Americans were annihilated. So this is called the Battle of Burnt Corn.
But it was more of a massacre?
Well, could be.
Okay.
Yeah, they lost big time, so could be. They went back to Pensacola. They rearmed, and there was a lot of talk about revenge. So a lot of the settlers in the area started coming together into little groups. One of these little groups was, there's a place that's now known as Fort Mims. Now, when we're talking fort, it was a small homestead, a small commune of families that had a wooden fence around it.
Which were just trees, like small trees just cut and placed very close together. You could fit a rifle barrel out of them, but that's about
correct.
it. Correct.
It just going and seeing the place, it really isn't significant. It was it was a small group of people coming together, very interracial. One of the things talked about is people bailing out of the military, AWOL, becoming deserters.
Okay.
So there was part of this community was Spanish deserters, like from Pensacola area. There was half Indian, half European. The owner of the place was that. There was a variety of other races and people from the community that came together there. They also had a small militia that went into there. Now, this place became a tragic comedy of errors. The militia leader was a drunk, and he passed out. And they also had a lot of slaves. Now, the slaves saw opposing force of Indians, and they reported it. They weren't believed, so they were tied up and whipped. And then in the middle of the night, this attack happened. So the opposing force of Native Americans, which it was the Upper Creek, which became known as Red Sticks, which red being war, attacked this fort, and they killed just almost everyone. There was somewhere in between 400 to 500 people that had come together, including the militia, and they were close to wiped out. There's reports of extreme brutality, of killing babies in horrifying ways. Now,
holy crap.
From this, it became a item leading into the United States becoming involved in what until then was largely a civil war within the Creek Nation.
And it was just a civil war. It was just basically a proxy war for the Americans as opposed to the British supported Red Sticks, right? I mean, well, the American allied White Sticks versus the British supported Red Sticks. It was just kind of a proxy war between the two.
It became that.
It became that.
I believe, yes. To the Native Americans, I don't know that that's the way they viewed it.
Oh, okay.
I would say definitely that's how we view it, as it became a proxy war. Okay. Which, with the brutality of that attack, we mentioned how Burnt Corn was a battle because the American militia won. This was called the massacre, the Fort Mims massacre. And a thing that came from it was remember Fort Mims, which just like, what come later of remember the Alamo. It became a battle cry that brought down Americans into the war.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like when in my the researching that I was doing, this was one of the first times where Andrew Jackson really started to distinguish himself as a military leader, because he was kind of paramount in getting the White Sticks to side with them in order to in arming them to fight against the Red Sticks. Am I correct in that, or was that?
I believe so. Yes. Okay. Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, that's when he was promoted to a major general or something to that effect.
Yes. Was there anyone else that was a major general?
Yes, in 1844 in Nauvoo, yes, there was. Yeah, I mean, the parallels, I think that plays into this this heroic ideal that you spoke on earlier. I think Joseph Smith thought that he was definitely his own hero, or he was the hero of his own story, which, I mean, we all suffered that to a certain extent. We all think that we're the coolest person on the earth. But I think Joseph had it to the point that it was deluding him to these thoughts of grandeur.
I think some of the aspects that direction we might want to take it is the Creek Indian War of largely the Native Americans, whether they were European and Native mix, or it didn't really matter. They chose White Stick, Red Stick.
Mm-hmm. They balkanized.
Yes, and falling in and following Andrew Jackson, the White Sticks. He became like the leader of that portion of the group, and then moved on, to the Battle of New Orleans, and he became governor of Florida. He went on to become a senator, I believe, and became president. You have a normal person, your average person, not elite, who succeeded and moved up to become president. And so just summing up, you have Joseph Smith that watched, and as Joseph Smith matured and became an adult, you can see a role model for him to follow of, I'm a major general. He wrote the Book of Mormon largely to establish that Native American religion of what, getting back to the Native. He told them what their roots were.
And that was one of the primary distinctions between the Red Sticks versus the White Sticks, right? Was the Red Sticks wanted to go back to who they were as the natives in general, get back to their tribal instinct, what they have been doing for the previous couple thousand of years before the Europeans started encroaching on their territory. Whereas the White Sticks were like, well, the Europeans are just going to wipe us all out, so we're better off to just team up with them and just go the European way and own plantations and slaves. And
which it didn't work out for them.
Well, of course, they still got steamrolled. I mean,
yes,
simple as that. Everybody kind of got screwed over by the Europeans as we moved in. So, I mean, I think that Joseph Smith was kind of following this role model of Andrew Jackson, right? Because he was seen as this one great leader, banding people together. He became this major general, and people did revere Andrew Jackson. That's why he got elected to his presidency, because of his distinguishing feats in the War of 1812. He ran on the platform of, I'm a homegrown guy. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, and I did all of this to help us with the War of 1812, and I led us to victory in New Orleans. And, he was, he was a role model for Joe. I think he said that very well. He was just a good role model. And, if Joe was able to create this book, this religious book that told the natives what their roots were, maybe he could be the next Tenskwatawa. Was it? Tenskwatawa? All right. Tenskwatawa. And maybe he could become the new prophet of the Native Americans. And that's, if you look at the preface of the Book of Mormon, you see that's that's what it was for. That's who it was written for, was the Native Americans, to help call the Lamanites back to Jesus. Tell them about Jesus appearing in the Americas 2,000 years before that, 1,800 years before that. So, I think that's an important connection to draw there is Andrew Jackson and Joseph Smith. He was kind of Joe's role model, and you can see why.
Coming from the War of 1812, in addition to Andrew Jackson, I believe some of the ramifications of the War of 1812, at that time period, there's aspects of average people, not your wealthy, not your landowners, of acquiring the right to vote and type. Is it that area correct? What can you clarify some of that?
So clarify the.
Well, my thought is the average man, in particular, not average person, the average man acquiring additional status in that time period.
Yeah, that was one of the significant elements of the War of 1812. One of the significant consequences. There were actually 3 or 4 major consequences of the War of 1812, but there was what we call a twin revolution: the empowerment of the common white man politically, and the empowerment of the common white man culturally. And so politically, because of the War of 1812, Republicans ended up sweeping the national and state elections after the War of 1812. They really disliked the eliteness of the Federalists. Federalists at that time were viewed as sort of puppets of the British government, right? And we were fighting a war against Britain, so they kind of looked like traitors. So the Federalist Party kind of died. It had died out during John Adams' presidency, but any remaining elements of it were completely gone because of the War of 1812. And so Republicans end up sweeping the elections, and they're very non-elitist. They're very sort of common man. They did understand that some federal control was necessary. So if you were not a slave, and you were not female, you experienced a great equalizing in the 1820s. 1830s. This
kind of all played into the what is it called? The era of good feelings. That's what I was looking for.
That's right, the era of good feelings. It was the era of good feelings only lasted for about 5 years. But this idea, it was very popular to think you could be anything you wanted. You could be president if you wanted. And Andrew Jackson, of course, becomes president in 1829. And so he becomes this role model, not just for Joseph Smith, but for lots of people who were just common. So during this time in the 1820s, most of the New England states get rid of the restrictions on voting. So people were moving around. About 75% of people ended up renting their homes because we're starting to transition away from the agrarian economy in New England to an industrial economy in the 1820s and 30s. And so having that restriction on owning property in order to vote, that ends up being eradicated by the 1830s in the area that Joseph Smith lived in New England. And so it is very common to think that you can be anything you want. It was also very common to take ownership, not just politically of your voting rights, but culturally and religiously as well. And so, of course, you've got the Second Great Awakening of the 1820s and 1830s with the evangelical movement and the development of folk religions. So,
I mean, that's what this era of good feelings went from basically 1815 to early 1820s. And
about 1817 to 1823 is
to 23.
Technically the era of good feelings. And of course, like all movements, there's no specific date that it ends and begins.
But I mean, that was obviously there was a lot going on, especially in the New England area as things were becoming more and more industrialized, as we were as we were no longer at war with Britain. We were no longer trying to ally with France in order to take over, or, to fight against Britain. We were, of course, we were still exterminating a lot of Native Americans at that time. That was just happening slowly at all times, more or less, wasn't it?
So the War of 1812 kicked off the removal treaties. So before that, Indians were being consolidated into smaller parts of their own homelands. And then after the war, the federal government, of course, developed the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 1820s, 1824, and removal treaties kick off. And so the Indians are really the biggest losers of the war. They start being forced to go west, right, across the Mississippi, and many of those tribes are being relocated. So Andrew Jackson, for instance, he thought the Indians were destined to die, and it was better to just relocate them away from white people and let them die off without the way his record on this reminds me of the way some cities deal with the homeless problems. Phoenix, for instance, or some of the cities around Phoenix. The way they deal with it is there will always be a homeless problem. They're probably going to die. So let's ship them all to one place. Let's ship them to downtown Phoenix. So let's relocate the homeless. And then they'll just be in one spot. So Andrew Jackson kind of reminds me of that with his Indian policy removal.
Oh, wow. So I want to draw an equivocation between Andrew Jackson and Helaman, because there's one battle that kind of stuck out in my mind when I was doing research here, and it was a battle of Horseshoe Bend. So what happened with this, Andrew Jackson had led these troops consisting of 2,600 American soldiers, which is 5 of them were Cherokee and 100 of them were Lower Creek allies. So you had 2,000 American soldiers, basically, that were these stripling warriors that they can be put as an analog to. So they came up against a hill near Tehopica, I believe that was what it's called, and they were attacking a red stick fortification. Jackson was firing firing cannons and artillery at the fortifications, and just wasn't even making a dent in them. They were just way too fortified. They'd have way too much time to set themselves up. So Jackson ended up ordering a bayonet charge, which bayonet charges can go one of two ways. Either they're extremely successful and, you take over whatever land you're charging towards, or you get chewed up, which, like with, on the Ostfront, Russians would often do these charges against just batteries of, German machine guns and just get cut up because they didn't have the ability of the old warfare style where they could run up and do a bayonet charge. They would just turn it into Swiss cheese. So Jackson did this bayonet charge, and apparently it was extremely successful. It was, the 39th U.S. Infantry was led by Colonel John Williams. They charged the breastworks and engaged the Red Sticks in hand-to-hand combat. By the end of it, roughly 800 to 1,000 Red Stick warriors in the battle had died. They had taken some prisoner, whereas in contrast, out of the 2,600 men that Jackson was leading, only 50 of the men had died, and only 154 were even wounded. So the casualty disparity between this amazing troop was led by General Andrew Jackson at the time, it was just it just destroyed the Red Stick fortification, completely wiped them out. And, it was seen as, I can only imagine that it was seen as one of the biggest victories that they could have against the Native Americans, because you have only 50 American men dead, and you have 800 to 1,000 Red Stick men dead. It seems almost like they're invincible, like the 2,000 stripling warriors. So I found that was kind of an interesting possible analog. Of course, when we're speculating about things like this, it is just that. It's only speculation. Mm-hmm. We can't say for a fact that Andrew Jackson was indeed Helaman or was indeed Captain Moroni or whatever, because there's a lot of parallels drawn between Captain Moroni and Old Hickory as well. So when we're talking about these parallels, I mean, it is just speculation, but I think it's still, there's possible connections there worth pointing out, at least correlations. And, Tecumseh was another one of those. Maybe Tim, you can throw in a little bit on this, but Tecumseh was, this Native American leader, and Teancum was this Lamanite leader. Tecumseh retreated after the Battle of Detroit up into northern Ontario, and that's where he died, in a little town called Moraviantown. And, Teancum in the Book of Mormon retreated after a battle and, died in a town called Morianton. And, let me just read this here. Yeah, you can, I'm sure you know, or you can elaborate on this a little bit more, but nobody really knows how Tecumseh died. We just know that he did indeed fall. Nobody knows who killed him. If it was a shot, if it was a spear or an arrow, nobody really knows, as far as I'm aware. Is that correct?
As far as I know.
Okay, fair enough. So, but what did happen was the 9th president of the United States, of course, Andrew Jackson was number 8, right?
Yes.
Okay, so number 9 was William Henry Harrison, and one of the platforms he ran on was he was the man who killed Tecumseh. And we have in Alma 62, and it came to pass that Teancum in his anger did go forth into the camp of the Lamanites and did let himself down over the walls of the city. And he went forth with a cord from place to place, insomuch that he did find the king, and he did cast a javelin at him, which did pierce him near the heart. But behold, the king did awaken his servants before he died, insomuch that they did pursue Teancum and slew him. So that might, I was seeing there were reports of William Henry Harrison was claiming. Apparently over 20 people claimed that they were the person that killed Tecumseh, but he claimed that he was indeed the guy that killed him. And why wouldn't he create some kind of amazing, fantastical story like this, where Tecumseh was in our camp, and that they had stormed our camp, and we shot at him, and then finally, Tecumseh was able to get a shot off, but then we chased him down and killed him. And, I see it's like this fantastical, epic of Tecumseh that can possibly be drawn as an analog to Teancum here in the Book of Mormon.
I think, when you were talking about the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, there's some additional aspects to that battle, but what you discussed was largely what was propagated, which rather than the technicalities of what happened, what was propagated in many ways is more important
what
than
people were saying.
The specifics of reality. So when you're talking about who killed Tecumseh, how did he die, that's not necessarily important. What's important is what people were told.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this comparison, once again, we were talking about Joseph Smith, who loved education. A lot of times it's talked about how he's uneducated. Well, his father was a teacher, so even if he wasn't he had some formal education. But in addition, his father, as well his mother's side. So while he's recovering, at a minimum, stuff's going through his mind. Now he's bringing in, I'm sure he's hearing some news. Maybe he's reading some different things. Maybe he's reading about various Indian tribes and stuff. So I can see this clearly as something that he could easily bring in and incorporate, start melding different things together.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it be in the Book of Mormon or in his life, he compiled all kinds of things. So with the Book of Mormon, he's pulling different things together. But beyond that, his motivation, why did he write the Book of Mormon? the introduction talks about how it's for the Lamanites, it's for the Native Americans. That's not how it's viewed today, but that was the original. And so beyond just writing that book, the purpose of it, of while he was a young boy and the way he could contribute was entertaining and telling stories, he's starting to formulate stories and role models. And Joseph Smith seemed to have a desire when he saw somebody that he admired, he wanted to take that person's place. And, this is something that you covered a little bit in another interview on the psychological aspects of Joseph Smith. And so without necessarily achieving a goal, he takes the reward. He was a major general without actually knowing anything. So
without being enrolled in any actual army, he was just the major general of his own Nauvoo Legion.
So the Mormon, when they marched down to Missouri, he never accomplished something.
But they felt damn good doing it.
Yeah, and afterwards is like, well, this was God's will. God didn't want us to... So he claims victory even with the total loss. So beyond the Book of Mormon items, I see where he takes and utilizes role models to achieve a further goal. So with that, it seems to me that Joe, beyond just bringing things together for the Book of Mormon, was modeling a path of following Old Hickory, of his military presence, becoming a major general, running for president himself, and beyond that, the Book of Mormon's purpose was for the Lamanites to give them a history of where they came from, to give them a religious model of where they were. So when you have the prophet that says, let's go back to our religious beginnings, Joe's able to step in and say, let me tell you what those were. You have forgotten this, but I can tell you what your beginnings were. And rather than everything being completely nefarious, there are aspects of the Native Americans were being moved out. Their attempts to meld into European society, many of those continued to result in the removal. So parts of these ideals, rather than fully being simply to gain power, you can see aspects, parts of this that maybe could have helped the Native Americans if they were actually able to assimilate and be accepted. If their heritage was truly Jewish, could you start sending them off, if they were Jews, if they were assimilating? The Creek War, Native Americans, and many of them having European descendancy also, they chose whether they were white stick or red stick. It wasn't necessarily a race-based item. And there's aspects in the Book of Mormon of their actions dictating their race, whether they're...
Because you had the Ammonites, and then you had the Nephites, and then you had the Lehites, and then the anti-Nephi Lehites, and then you had all these people, and they were not necessarily distinguished by who they were descended from. It was by their actions, by if they were following what the prophets were saying, if they were, if they were allied with the Nephites, or if they were allied with the Lamanites, or what, like the Ammonites putting down their weapons of war, and then these 2,000 stripling warriors of Helaman having to come to their rescue and help them, that they were, they were allied with the Nephites at the time. So, I mean, yeah, it's not necessarily a line that's drawn, a black and white line that's drawn in the sand or by a geographic distinguishing mark. I would assume it was more like each individual tribe or each family would talk with each other, and they would probably argue and bicker about which way they wanted to go, if they were going to oppose the European invasion or if they were going to embrace it like the White Sticks had. And I think that's, that dichotomy is set out very clearly in the Book of Mormon with what people do as far as their political actions go.
I believe so. And even years later, just a podcast or two ago, you discussed how Ollie was sent down into Independence, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he initially ran into the Shawnee there.
Which is what Tecumseh and
Tenskwatawa.
Thank you, Tenskwatawa.
The prophet.
The prophet. Yeah, they descended from the Shawnees as well, right?
Correct. Exactly.
Interesting.
So even he moved on and started talking to Chief Anderson, I believe. But independence. Why independence? Why, we have God, that is Zion, God said so.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of a different reason is that's where the Shawnee, the whole aspect of this. Now, was Joseph imagining himself as the prophet and Ollie as the brother Tecumseh and sending him down? I don't know.
Right. We can't, we're too far separated. We can't talk to these people. We don't know. But we can look at it and say, so this is what happened. These were the political things that were happening beyond or before it, and what might have led Joseph to choose Independence, Missouri over any other place. Or, that they were in Kaw, Missouri, I think was the border Lamanite Native American settlement that they were actually proselyting to of the Shawnee tribe there. Why else would he choose it? Because these people had their prophet and spiritual leader as well as their military leader, and they had both fallen in the War of 1812, and there was a vacuum there that maybe Joe thought that he could fill. I don't know, but it's all speculation. We have to be clear about that.
However it played out, you can very clearly see how a young 12-year-old boy laying in bed, unable to function completely, could be strongly influenced, laying there daydreaming about the instances that he's hearing about.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So, Clara, please weigh in. We definitely need to get to seeing what else was going on with the War of 1812 and how the rest of the country reacted after it was all over, after everything was done, basically.
Bring us back to true academics.
Yes, please.
I think you guys hit on an important part of the consequences of 1812 and carrying over, as you mentioned, he's laying there in bed and not able to do much but daydream and create stories. And, I don't know much about his life, but it sounds like that would be your option if you're recovering from surgery at that time. But that egalitarian impulse that developed as a result of not just the war being won, sort of the feeling of that, the common man can do anything, but with the Republicans being in power, they were very anti-elitist, right? And so I think that people in situations like Joseph Smith's family was really grabbed onto the idea of not just egalitarianism in voting. So voting rights, restrictions are lifted, so any free white man could vote without having to own property. Mm-hmm. But when it transfers over to cultural practices as well, the religion becomes very democratic. So you can choose salvation just like you choose to participate in the political process. And this idea of choosing salvation or choosing to follow God or choosing to follow God's spokesman, a prophet, became very exciting at that time. And I think you can see why a poor white family would grab on to something like that, because it does act as not just a stabilizing force for poor whites in the New England area, and really across America, but in the New England area, their lives became very unstable because of the development of industrialization, the beginning of industrialization, but also with the Republicans in charge, that era of the era of good feelings produced this new national infrastructure. So turnpikes started being developed, roads, canals, railroads, and people started moving around. And so anytime people start moving around, it creates stress and it creates a very unstable situation mentally. And so people will grab on to something that seems to offer hope or stability. And so being able to choose how you're going to respond to that politically by voting, you can now vote, or culturally by choosing to participate in a religious process, can offer stabilizing forces. It's also very hopeful, and it helps you secure your place in the world once again. If all these national forces, which are too big for any one person to have control over, if you have no control over not being able to find a job, well, at least you do have control over, say, your eternal salvation. You can choose to participate. And so I think that era of good feelings and that egalitarian impulse really is something that people like Joseph Smith's family, poor, white, landless Americans really grab onto. And I think that's why folk religion starts developing in the 1820s as part of the Second Great Awakening.
And let's be clear, Mormonism is definitely a folk religion. I mean, it's derived from folk magic practices. I mean, it had a lot of Judeo-Christian undertones, and that's why Jesus Christ appears so much in it. But it was still heavily entwined with this idea of folk magic practices and, and an agrarian lifestyle in general, and being able to multiply and till the earth. And that was considered righteousness, was being able to make a living for yourself, a Republican idea like that. Yeah,
I think so. So folk religion, of course, that name kind of indicates nonconformist, non-traditionalist. But when I think of it, I think of a number of characteristics that would describe folk religion. So anyone, in this case, maybe any man, could be a preacher. So that's the first one. The emergence of mysticism, again, intertwining with Christianity. You hadn't seen that for a little bit in America, at least. You had not seen mysticism or folk magic practices intertwined with Christianity for quite some time in America. In the 1820s, you see that intertwining again. And then the third concept of these folk religion, this folk religion and the number of denominations and new sects that develop are a tinkering with marriage concepts.
Okay.
So a number of new Christian denominations, Church of Christ, Seventh-day Adventists, the Shakers, etc., develop during this time. And then I'd add a fourth element of folk religion is a large informal gathering of worship. So Charles Finney comes about during this time. He is considered the father of revivalism. So he would hold revivals and camp meetings across the country, right? And so people kind of grab onto that, and they would use revivals or large camp meetings not only for religious democracy, meaning anybody can participate. You're not just listening to some elite white educated guy up there preach at you, but anybody can participate. But he would also use revivals to push for suffrage and for education. And so they take on a political tone as well. So that's how I would describe folk religion. And I think Mormonism fits within that.
Yeah, within that same sphere. I mean, it's, that's a really, really good way to sum it up, sum all of it up. And that's, I mean, Mormonism didn't come out of a vacuum. I mean, we've made that abundantly clear in just today's discussion, but I mean, that's what the whole podcast is about, is it didn't just crop up out of nothing. It wasn't, It wasn't this young prophet that was visited by God and Jesus in personhood. And then it was the original church established by Jesus being restored to Zion, the New Jerusalem. That's not what Mormonism really was. That's not where it came from.
Yeah, and if I could just add one more thing about that. So we're talking about this egalitarian impulse, right? And how it developed folk religion, right? And it wasn't just the structure of the Mormon church that resulted from this egalitarianism. It was also the type of people who were attracted to Mormonism. So if you look at, and again, this is all coming out because of the War of 1812, right? And so the non-elite movements, activism becomes very popular in the 1820s and 1830s, right? And this idea that anyone can participate religiously as well as politically. You can choose, if you're a white man, you can choose what you're going to do. That was such a popular idea. You can be an
astronaut.
Right. You could be anything you wanted. Yeah. And so Mormonism became very attractive to specific groups of people. And if you were in one of my lectures, I would ask the students, what type of people do you think would become very attracted to religious democracy?
People that had been, where Protestantism spawned in the first place. People that felt like they didn't have their voice heard in the Catholic religion. People that felt like they were being controlled by a religious leader, a single religious leader in power. If somebody comes to them with a new democratic-based religion, which, let's be honest, that's kind of what the Mormon church is. I mean, it has a corporation of leadership, basically, but the longer time you spend in that church, the more power you have, basically, the more of a voice you have, the more you're able to contribute.
I can see aspects of those without necessarily as much education. So power and education is probably pretty comparable. It's an interesting thought that you have someone with a peepstone that trumps somebody that is a theologian and has studied. And, it's an interesting aspect of equality of not just can you become, but you pick up a rock and ta-da, I am the prophet, skipping the 10 years of education.
Very true.
Was this largely just Mormonism? Was this something, so there was a multitude of little groups popping up.
Yeah,
were a lot of them anti-education, or I don't know if that's the proper way to put it, but
anti-elite would be more the way I would describe it. It was very popular. Mormonism wasn't the only sect that would attract poor working class men, especially, and of course women were involved as well. But it was very attractive to poor white working class men who had experienced economic upheavals because of all the industrialization. In the 1830s, it really gave men a way to feel like men again when industrialization was taking their livelihood away. This idea that the key to salvation was through men, the development of patriarchy. It gave men a way to feel like they had a place in the world again. In the 1830s, with industrialization, interchangeable parts were introduced at that time. Agrarianism had begun its downhill decline.
Or maybe it's removal into more rural parts, right? Because agrarianism didn't necessarily decline from what I understand. It just got moved to different parts of the country, right?
It did get pushed out to the Old Northwest. We had talked about further inland. You have much farmland in many acres of farmland in New England being sold to factory owners. And so farmland's being turned into factories.
Okay.
Right?
So I was looking at that from like a overarching, like all across the entire colony's perspective. But you're saying more just focused on the burned over district where Joseph Smith was growing up.
And certainly there were still farms all across New England. Absolutely. And there's both reasons are correct. For sure. But that transition from what we call a household economy, where everyone works to contribute to the household economy, was shifting to an industrial economy. And so you do have the idea of religious democracy, where anyone can participate. But and that idea is good, but it also acts as a stabilizer because white men were feeling very unstable as we're transitioning to industrialization, particularly because sometimes women would be hired for work because you could pay them cheaper in the new factories, right? In Joseph Smith's area as well. And so it becomes sort of a hard scrabble life if you're not able. 77% of Americans in New England rented their properties. They didn't own land. And so if you're renting land as a farmer, it kind of makes for a difficult life. Oh, yeah, definitely. Right? So these working class men and these artisans whose jobs were being lost, they didn't know where they fit into society anymore. And so that egalitarian impulse also acts as a stabilizer for them.
Wow. The pieces of the prophet puzzle are many and very, very small, but they're, the more we learn about this kind of stuff, it really, really plays into the larger perspective of who Joseph Smith was and how Mormonism became what it is today and what it was under Joseph's rule. You can almost see the evolution of Joseph Smith himself too, because we had the Book of Mormon, which was his initial claim to fame document, but we also had the Doctrine and Covenants, which were the living revelations, which were the things that he would come up with on the fly. And we see how some of them come in direct conflict with some of the tenets that are held in the Book of Mormon, not just with polygamy, but with like Trinitarian beliefs, with the perspective on secret combinations and masonry. And I mean, there's a lot of things there that you can draw connections to. And I don't know, I just really enjoy seeing the evolution of Joseph Smith because he was such a dynamic and fantastic character in all of American history. I cannot get enough of him. So to close us up, Tim, do you want to give us a final thoughts segment on what you think about everything we've talked today?
Sure. I think reemphasize the point that I've mentioned a couple times of how Joseph Smith was an amazing compiler. Rather than having original ideas, rather than creating something from scratch. It appears to me, whether it's the Book of Mormon or the church or his life, he was amazing at taking bits and pieces and melding them together. So we can look at this and say, okay, Joseph Smith looked to Tecumseh. No, it was the prophet. No, it was Old Hickory. And he's taken bits and pieces and forming a life, a plan. Now, how much of this was planned out and how much was lived on the fly, who knows? My assumption is it came together as it went along. But the aspects of coming up with the Book of Mormon and saying, this is what the prophet was telling you to get back to. The prophet, as in Tecumseh's brother, who was named Tenskwatawa.
Neither of us can get that down.
Tenskwatawa.
Yes, that guy. So he was able to step in and say, I want to be that person, and make it happen without much effort, just declaring himself, I am the prophet. This is your history. without actually going into what the history was. So my summation is he was absolutely amazing at grabbing bits and pieces and pulling them together, whether it has any reality to time and space, bringing aspects of the Incas together with his homeland in New York, what was present for him, comparing with 3,000 years prior. Time, space, it don't matter. He was able to bring them all in and meld them together.
Yeah. And he didn't have any qualms about scholarship either. I mean, he didn't have any scholarship. He didn't have any formal education on, archaeology and on what people were finding with the mound builders. He didn't have any of that formal thing, those formal things that you would expect somebody that has a direct pipeline to, the God of the universe would know. Yeah. But he just simply didn't have it. And a lot of things, I mean, just the Book of Abraham alone, it's so blasphemously wrong. It's just offensively wrong because Joseph Smith just didn't know what he was doing.
One thing we mentioned is the reality, the history of events and facts aren't as important as people's perspective of them.
Mm-hmm. And drawing connections that might not exist.
Zelf is a wonderful example of what we're talking about here, of he's tromping along in Missouri, stumbles upon a skeleton semi-recently dead, and proclaims it a couple 1,000-year-old warrior. He's distant from New York. He's distant from Mesoamerica. It don't matter. Mm-hmm. A year old, 2,000, whatever. It's all good.
Well, it was all Joseph Smith's echo chamber. Whatever he said inside of his echo chamber, people agreed with and people understood, and that's he didn't. I don't think he had a whole lot of naysayers, and anybody that was a naysayer, he just kicked them out. It was a lot easier that way instead of trying to adjust based off of the evidence, trying to adjust what you said, because a prophet never says anything wrong. And he said a lot of wrong things, and I think he ran into a lot of problems with that.
We see that today.
Yes, indeed. So, Clara, let's hear a final roundup from your perspective. What do you think about everything we talked about today?
If we elevate this to a national level, if we do a bird's eye view, I think that we can look at Joseph Smith as not unique in his era. Because of a number of things related to the War of 1812, which was what you originally wanted to talk about, and some of those consequences. And so because the anti-elite movements kicked off as a direct result of the War of 1812, the Federalists had looked really treasonous during the war. The Republicans take over. They're very non-elite. That egalitarian impulse spreads to removing voting restrictions, but it also spreads to the development of folk religion. All of these groups are popping up all over New England, right? The Oneida group, the Adamites, Seventh-day Adventists, the Millerites, the Shakers, all of these groups, they all have very similar characteristics to the Mormons. Most of them die out. Sure, in a later podcast, you'll get around to why the Mormons remained. Most of those groups die out. But that idea that anyone can participate politically, religiously, culturally in your community became so popular that we can look at Joseph Smith as a part of a wave of activity in the 1820s and 30s that comes about because of that activism advocating for free white European American men to be able to participate in those sorts of activities.
Very, very nicely said. Very well summed up. And I have to be honest, I really appreciate you both coming to the table with a lot of preparation. I'm just flat out impressed with how much preparation you guys did. So I want to personally thank you guys very, very much for doing this and for offering your voices. And just on a quick wrap-up note, I think the main reason I wanted to do this is because I had made some infactual assertions about the War of 1812, and sometimes I can fall prey to the same problems that Joseph Smith had. A podcasting room can be an echo chamber in and of itself. I can do a whole bunch of research and draw connections that might not actually exist, or I can make assumptions about things that happened that aren't necessarily accurate, and then I speak it into a microphone, and then I post it up on the internet, and then it's open to scrutiny. It's open to people coming in and correcting me. And that's what I want to do. As much as possible, I want to be as intellectually honest as possible, and I think that's what this was all about. I had said the War of 1812 was because Britain was trying to take back over America. And that's not really the case. It might have played a very, very, very tiny part in it, but it was I had a completely juvenile and inaccurate perspective of what the War of 1812 was. And I have learned a ton just sitting here and talking with you guys. And I just thank you so very much for doing this.
You're welcome. Well, President Madison had the same exact thought you did. He was absolutely convinced that Britain was trying to take over the United States. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that you're the only one who thinks that. And that's the great thing about history and historians. We can sit around and flesh these things out.
There you go.
And it happens all the time.
Good. Yeah. And that's what it is. It's a checks and balances, right? Nobody is the single history authority. And I sure as hell don't claim any part of that. And I'm always open to scrutiny.
An item of history is perspective. You gather facts, but you still have a perspective that you're viewing them.
Yeah, definitely. Just to wrap us up, I will say that in the 3 days of research that I was doing leading up to our conversation today, because we'd been planning this out since like Wednesday or so, and I was trying to look for a lot of the connections that are in the Book of Mormon to certain like battles that happened in the Book of Mormon, to see if the same battles had happened in the War of 1812, and see if there's a lot of connections between big people that were heavy hitters in the War of 1812 as opposed to in the Book of Mormon. And I gotta be honest, there's not much out there on it. There's been a couple of books written, very small books, about the connections between Old Hickory and Captain Moroni. There's been little connections here and there, but most of what I was doing, I couldn't find anything on the internet. So I think that there's a massive plethora of scholarship and study and research that needs to be done there. And it's not at all within my vein of expertise to do it. I hope that somebody, maybe someday listening to this in the backlog, will pick up and say, let me just read that War of 1812, that book that Joseph might have had, and the Book of Mormon, and compare them line by line. Because I think there's probably a lot of deep connections hidden in there that we haven't been able to tease out because the scholarship just hasn't been done yet. So open petition to anybody that wants to do some research and scholarship. I think that would be a really, really good book idea. So yeah, all in all, thank you two very, very much. Once again, thank you. And thanks for having me in your home and hosting a lovely party last night. And I guess we'll close this episode out. Tim, Clara, thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate you having us.
Thanks for having us.
And once again, that was a lot of fun, and I had a really good time with that discussion. Thank you so much, Clara and Tim. I really felt like I needed to clarify some things with the late war of, I called it the late War of 1812 because that's the book that I call it by. But the War of 1812 in general, there were a lot of things that I wasn't very certain on that I felt like I needed clarification on. And you guys really helped to provide a lot of context and overarching umbrella information that I needed to know about the War of 1812, and I hope the listeners will enjoy it just as much as I enjoyed having the discussion. With that, we'll move on to a listener mail segment real quick here. Got in an email from Eric, and he says he's a new listener of 3 weeks and now a contributor, so thank you very much, Eric. He also said, I haven't heard you yet reference Dan Vogel's Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet, or H. Michael Marquardt's The Rise of Mormonism, or tapping another type, Richard A. Baines and David Fitzgerald's books. Are these among your references? And I sent him back an email and said, well, I wasn't aware of Dan Vogel's Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet, but that's definitely on my list now to get. H. Michael Marquardt's Rise of Mormonism is one of my favorite books to reference because it's just so concise and so well put together and very, very factual. There's just no refuting the arguments that Marquardt makes and the presentation that he makes of the subject matter. I've actually never heard of Richard Abane before, and David Fitzgerald is one of my favorite authors, and I actually had him on for a special edition episode. So if you want to go back to listen to episode 11, special edition episode 11, you can hear my interview with David Fitzgerald, and we talk about both of his books quite a lot. Beyond that, he also says, I ask because I'm curious about your writing goals. Is there room for another book in this field? Is there new ground to be covered or a new approach that would draw a substantial new audience? Are you depending on winning a contract with an established publishing house? Ever thought of a graphic novel? So in response to that, Eric, right now, as it sits for the book, it's a little bit up in the air at the moment. I'm kind of deciding what I want to do because there's so many books that have presented Mormonism and Joseph Smith in such a revealing light in the way that Dan Vogel and H. Michael Marquardt do, because, I mean, they do a fantastic job of it. And I don't know if there's always room for people to add new perspectives on old facts. I mean, that's just what a lot of books are for, is reading people's different takes on or different perspectives on what their research has come up with. But I think something that could be done very well, and it's the direction that I think I'm going to take with the books here, is Joseph Smith in first person, basically, like a dramatic novel almost, where I'm planning on telling the story of Joseph Smith through Joseph's eyes as he was experiencing things, and not having footnotes in it, but just having references in wherever there is a quote or there's a situation that comes up that is based on facts and that has happened in the past, and then tacking onto the end of the book like a huge appendix or like an end notes section of the book. Like if you go back and look at Grant Palmer's book, 1/3 of it is actual content and 2/3 of it is just his references for the research that he was doing. And it's really good to do it that way because it's hard to refute. If you're looking at this book from a historian's perspective, it's, Grant Palmer might say something that you're like, well, I don't know if that sounds as good. Let me go back and you look in the appendix and you see that everything that he talks about in the appendix at the end is way more than what he had presented just in the beginning part of the book where he was talking about it. So I think that could be done very, very well from Joseph Smith's perspective, doing it as like, kind of a dramatic novel type thing, using facts to, a dramatic story based on the facts, almost like a Work in the Glory type book, but without the pro-Mormon slant on it. So that's kind of where the plans sit for the first book. And then, of course, the second book will be a deconstruction of the Book of Mormon. That will probably be separate from the first book, because the first book is hopefully going to be the initiation into a full series of books that will kind of tackle the view of Mormonism and the history of it in small chunks, kind of like the podcast itself does. And then I would really like to include all of the end notes at the end of the book as well, just so if there is question about scholarship, people can look at the scholars and the places that I'm deriving the sources from and judge the merits of the claims based on that alone. So yeah, like I said, Eric, it's all up in the air at the moment, but the more I think about it, the more I chew on it and weigh out the pros and cons, the more I'm starting to understand exactly what these books are going to be. So I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, thank you for sending in the email, Eric. Got in an email from Matt, and the main point of his email that I wanted to talk about was the DNA studies. He says, have you read about the DNA studies showing absolutely nothing pointing to any Middle Eastern DNA connection in the Native American DNA? I believe this was a couple years ago. Thought it was interesting and surprised you hadn't mentioned it. Well, there's actually a fantastic YouTube video. It's only like 25 minutes long, and it's called DNA, Geography, and the Book of Mormon by Aaron Shafovalov. I think that's what his name is. But he's kind of pegged as one of the typical anti-Mormons, super Christian-y anti-Mormons, but he does a really, really good job of deconstructing DNA in the Book of Mormon and how there's just absolutely no connection there. There is nothing that shows our DNA record that lends any credibility to what's in the Book of Mormon, and it's one of the big problems with it. I can't remember. I don't think I ever said anything about that in the 7.5 hour episode about the Book of Mormon, just because it's I maybe it just didn't occur to me, or maybe I didn't think it was necessary because it had already been so horribly deconstructed already. I don't know, but yeah, that's definitely something to look at and research and take a look at. So Matt, yes, thank you for pointing that out. DNA definitely disproves the Book of Mormon beyond any shadow of any doubt. The Native Americans are not of Hebrew descent. No Native American tribe is of any Hebrew or Semitic descent. So, yes, thank you for clarification, and thanks for sending in the email, Matt. And that was all the listener mail I needed to address. I did want to just thank you. There's a lot of other emails that I received that were just, people saying thank you for the show, or they're enjoying the show, and honestly, I don't want to mention all of those because it just takes, it becomes repetitive and redundant after a while. But when I see them, it doesn't feel redundant or repetitive whatsoever. So I do want to personally thank you, each and every person who does send in an email saying that they are appreciating the show, or they found one part of it interesting or something, because getting that feedback, that positive feedback, helps to balance out any of the negative feedback that I'm receiving. And it really, helps to motivate me to keep going on the show and keep doing what I'm doing, or to change things for the better. So just thank you so very much to everybody that's sending in that positive reinforcement on those emails. Next thing I needed to discuss was chats, Mormon.org chats. I've received a couple of these in, and we're going to read a couple of them because they're just delightful. This one was sent from Julie, who operates the Twitter handle The Real Emma Hale, and she was chatting with a missionary, I assume, named Ella. And it goes, let's see, what brings you to Mormon.org chat? And then Julie replies, yes, I would like to ask about Joseph Smith's use of folk magic in relation to the Book of Mormon. What do you mean? Well, he used a form of folk magic called scrying to get the words of the Book of Mormon, like a crystal ball. The person, of course, asks, do you mean to translate the Book of Mormon? Julie says, sort of. And then they ask, of course, in a total textbook deflection, do you believe in God, Julie? And then, of course, Julie just hunkers down. He didn't translate it because he got the words from a magic stone, like someone would look into a crystal ball. That is what I mean. That really isn't translation, if that makes sense. Okay, so the person, Ella, replies, okay, so we believe in God the Father and in his Son Jesus Christ. The Book of Mormon were his ancient records written by the prophets in the Americas in 600 BC to 400 AD. Joseph Smith translated, blah, blah, blah. He was given a tool that he could use called seer stones. This isn't magic. He was able to translate the words from ancient Reformed Egyptian into English. From one language into another language is called translation. Ella, you are so misinformed. And then Julie goes on to ask, may I ask how getting words from a stone isn't magic and how that is translation? I mean, it is well documented that the Smith family dabbled in folk magic. Lucy Smith even said they did in her memoir. And then the person replies, because the power of God exists and God can do anything. Of course, God's amazing, isn't he? People were healed by looking at a stick with a snake on it. Well, okay. Moses parted the Red Sea with a staff. How this is the power of God who loves us and wants us to have faith in him. That didn't make any sense, but I read it exactly how it is. And then she dropped in a link to LDS.org article. And of course, Julie comes back with a can't, quote, God can do anything, unquote, be an explanation to excuse anything, which I totally agree with. And how does that answer negate the historical evidence that Joseph did do folk magic and use the seer stone like a crystal ball? I mean, if his mom said they did, then they did practice magic. And then Ella replies, So the thing is, the best evidence we have is to read the Book of Mormon and just don't worry about the history. It's all about reading the Book of Mormon itself. Because if it word of God, then we know what was said is true. Wow, that was a tough one. Also, you can read the testimony of the 3 witnesses and 8 witnesses who saw Joseph translate the records. You can read that here, ... and they forgot to provide the link or something. And then Julie said, well, no, they didn't. They said they saw him put a stone in his hat and he buried his face in it. Emma said that this was the sole method that he used after the 114 pages were lost. Well said, Julie. All right, Ella fires back. You can read it for yourself here, but we aren't to convince you. If you don't believe or even have the faith to ask God for yourself, there is nothing we can do to help you. Have a great day. And then she leaves a couple more links. And then Julie fires back. Yes, I want to know exactly what the connection between the Book of Mormon and Smith family use of folk magic. You cannot answer that question? And then Ella comes back with, we already answered you, but if you already have your answer, why did you come here on Mormon.org chat in the first place? Great question that was ended with a period instead of a question mark. Julie said, I wanted a full explanation from a person who is here to teach about these issues. Oh, so well said. Thank you so much, Julie. That was amazing. And then the last message is sent by Ella, and she said, like I said, you can read the account for yourself. We don't believe that it was translated by magic, exclamation mark, but that it was translated by the power of God that all may be able to read it. If you want, you can be able to read the actual Book of Mormon, which is another testament of Christ. Thanks once again for coming online and hope you enjoy your reading. The chat has ended. I love these so much. Just to see them try and pretzel themselves into some kind of shape that makes the apologist make sense. It's just beautiful. So Julie, I should say the real Emma Hale, go follow her on Twitter. She does a lot of cool stuff. She puts a lot of fun quotes on there. Thank you. That was a very awesome chat, and I think you did a really good job with it. And, thanks for sending it in. Got in another couple of chats from a person that asked me to keep their name anonymous here. But for the first chat, they actually did 2 of these chats. The first one, they used the pseudonym Stanley Milgram. Very, very well done. All right, I'm going to read these real quick and maybe edit some of these out. It started out with Stanley and let's see. Apparently they were talking to M. So Stanley starts out, I was wondering why Joseph Smith joined the Methodist Church after receiving his vision informing him that no other churches are true. The person replied, one of parents were the Methodist. He has attended many other Christian church because his family was sent to church every Sunday. Then he was confused about why are there many churches. Stanley starts out, so Joseph Smith received his first vision in 1820, am I correct? They reply, yes, you know about Joseph Smith very well. How did you know it? Stanley replies, before that, his mother Lucy, his brothers Hiram and Samuel, as well as Sophronia were Presbyterians, and his father was Universalist. They had attended the Methodist faith, but before the first vision, he had not joined the Methodist Church. I've read The Pearl of Great Price and also Rough Stone Rolling. I came across something very recently which has created a bit of a question. And then, of course, the person replies, have you prayed to know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God? And Stanley replies, in Joseph Smith History 119, Joseph Smith was told, I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong. This happened in 1820, correct? My question is, why did he join the Methodist Church in 1828? How does this fit with the first vision instruction not to join any other church? Which seems like a very, very reasonable question. They replied, he was looking for the truth and he attended many churches, but it doesn't mean that that was after he had the first vision. Where did you get that information from? Stanley replies, in 1828, while living with Isaac Hale, 8 years after the first vision, Joseph Smith joined the Methodist Church. It is on the records of the Methodist Church in that region that Isaac Hale's son-in-law joined the Methodist Church in June of 1828. The person replied, that information is not true. We would like to help you know more about the true story. Amazing. Would you like to keep in contact with us? We can send the local missionaries, and you will know that this is true or not by yourself. Would you like to know? And then Stanley, of course, fires back a very hard question. Are you claiming that the Methodist Church invented the story? Did they invent a member of their congregation that didn't exist? Why does Isaac Hale's congregational record state that he joined the Methodist Church in June of 1828 if it isn't true? And then they reply, would you like to know by yourself? We want to invite you to read the Book of Mormon, which is the evidence of this church. Stanley fires back once again. The records of the Methodist Church in Harmony, Pennsylvania claim that Joseph Smith joined in June of 1828. And just like that, the chat ends and kicks him over to somebody else. So then it says that he's now chatting with Louisa and Aaron. And they say, hi, Stanley, how can we help you today? He said, hi, what happened to the other people I was chatting with? Where did they go? You were talking to them a long time ago, which if you look at the timestamps, no, it was just minute by minute. He was not talking to them a long time ago. He said, not that I don't want to chat with you. I'm sure that you will be helpful and friendly, etc. The person says, okay, I'm going to see if I can transfer you to those other missionaries. So Stanley says, not that I don't want to chat with you. I'm sure that you will be helpful and friendly, etc. No, the chat record shows that at 3:48 they were chatting with me, and at 3:48 both of them left, and now I am chatting with you two lovely sisters. Well, 3:48 my time. I don't know which time zone you're in. And then they replied back, okay, I'm going to see if I can transfer you to the other missionaries. And then Stanley says, or at least find out why they bowed out of the conversation or what happened. I can continue to chat with you two if you can't connect to them. And then, of course, the person replies back, the missionary you were talking to is not online anymore. Probably the internet connection failed. I'm sorry. That's what they're going to say. The internet connection failed because they couldn't answer a question. Anyway, Stanley says, okay, that's fine. I had a question about Joseph Smith. Am I correct in assuming that the first vision occurred in 1828? And then they replied, yes. And then he says, okay, my question is, why did Joseph Smith attempt to join the Methodist Church in June of 1828 as evidenced in, and then it cuts out again. He isn't even able to finish his statement. And he's chatting with somebody else. So, after he starts to chat with a new person, this is amazing. Just a ping ponging. He can't stick with one single person because they just can't, they can't answer his questions. It's beautiful. He said, sorry, I didn't finish my last statement. As evidence in the church of where Isaac Hale was a member and as discussed by B.H. Roberts, A Comprehensive History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Hi, Camille. How are you doing? I'm going to have to leave now because guests just arrived. I was originally talking to some elders and then to some sisters, all left without answering my questions, but I have to go now. And the person replies back, sorry about that. So the missionaries gave Stanley the runaround here for a half an hour without ever actually answering any of the hard questions that he was posing to him. And by the end of it, they just kept ping-ponging him around to different missionaries. It's just amazing. Wow. Very, very nicely done. The next chat that I need to talk about here, the person used a pen named Lucinda, and they were talking to a couple of people here. So I gotta give it to Lucinda on this one. She just completely destroys the missionaries here. So I'm just going to read some of the highlights here. Lucinda starts with the question, can you tell me about Joseph Smith? Was he a good man? The person replies, yes, as a member of the church, I have come to learn that he was truly called as a prophet of God. What makes you interested in learning more about the church? Lucinda replies, well, I know many LDS who are good people, but I've also heard some things about Joseph Smith that make me wonder. Did Joseph Smith marry other men's wives? Did he burn down a printing press? Two very legitimate questions. The reply comes, the one way to know if he truly was called of God is to read the Book of Mormon. We believe that he was able to translate the ancient record into English through the power of God. I can't believe that that's what they retreat to. That's their point of fortification, is the Book of Mormon. And it has been proved beyond any shadow of a doubt to be completely absurd. And that's what they fall back to. Anyway, Lucinda says, okay, I can do that. But what about my questions? Well done. And, bringing them back in full circle, making it so they can't divert like that. The person replied, I don't know. I haven't heard about that. You can see more on LDS.org. It has lots of history on the church. Then Lucinda says, okay, have you read the Gospel Topics essay, Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo on LDS.org? The person replies, oh, yes, I have read some of it. So are you referring to polygamy and why it was practiced? Lucinda replies, polygamy, polyandry, and marrying other men's wives. Someone told me that the passage allowing that to happen is still in D&C 132. Has it been removed from LDS canon, or is it still in official scriptures? And then at that point, something weird happens. Lucinda was only chatting with 2 people, but then somebody else comes in, and it's kind of weird. So the person named Sanku comes in, and let's see. Lucinda says, so was D&C 132 removed, or was it amended to eliminate any permission to practice polygamy? Then the chat replies, no, it is still there. However, like as in the biblical times, people practice polygamy if commanded by God. It is the same that applies here. They were commanded by God to practice to help the people. However, after the people were okay, they were asked to stop. Well, that seems like a bit of a whitewashing of the history, but okay, let's see where they're going to go with this. And of course, Lucinda comes back. They were asked to stop, but the scripture wasn't modified? Does this mean that the stuff in that section about being an eternal principle still applies? They come back with, well, if God commanded it again, then we would need to follow his commandments. Of course, it was all God's commandment at the time. It isn't God's commandment anymore, even though it's still in there. So Lucinda comes back. I see. Now, Doctrine and Covenants section 132 says that they should only marry virgins and only with the consent of the first wife and only for raising up seed. The article, meaning plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, claims that Joseph Smith married some women who were married to other women, and in some cases married some women without having any children. Did Emma provide consent to all of Joseph Smith's wives? If the commandment to engage in polygamy is the same one recorded in D&C 132, why are there inconsistencies between what was commanded and what the Gospel Topics essay records as actually happening? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to make sense of all of this. That seems very, very logical. And of course they come back with, which verse are you looking at? And then Lucinda says, Section 132.61 states that he can only marry other virgins. In the first version gave her consent, but only if they are virgins. But some of the women were married to other men first, or weren't they? Verse 62 limits the maximum number of wives at 10. Did Joseph Smith have more than 10 wives? Wow, Lucinda, you're just burying them. This is amazing. And then the chat replies with, he did, to be honest. I don't claim to understand polygamy. I know I don't understand all things, but I know that God does, and I've come to know that Joseph Smith was a prophet, so these things don't bother me. I trust that God helped them to do what needed to be done. I know I can understand this more over time. They're obviously in defensive mode, and just the cognitive dissonance must be killing them at this point. So Lucinda comes back with, so are you okay with this? It doesn't bother you? Even if it appears to violate the actual text of a revelation which you believe comes from God? Or are there other revelations that counter D&C 132? Did God give a section 132? How should I feel about this? And then at that point, everybody drops out of the chat. All 3 people just completely gone, dropped out of the chat. They couldn't answer Lucinda's questions anymore. And oh my goodness, it's just amazing. So after that, somebody else pops in, Suzanne and Nancy apparently, and Lucinda just goes back and forth with them again, and they just, it's just ridiculous. The person says that they had to leave because they needed to go for another assignment. They didn't, and then Lucinda says they didn't say anything. They didn't even say goodbye. The person says, oh, I'm sorry. And then it's just ridiculous. Just seeing them back up and just not be able to handle this. It's just absolutely amazing. Wow. And, the chat goes on further than that, but I feel like I'm kind of riding a dead horse at this point. I mean, it goes on and on and on. It's just unbelievable. So Lucinda, Julie, and Stanley, everybody that sent in chats with the Mormon.org chats, Those were absolutely delightful. Hopefully I didn't drone on too long just reading these here, and I'll edit out some of the less interesting parts. But wow, that was just hilarious for me to read those the first time and just see how much they deflect, and they're incapable of actually answering any really hard questions. Just wow. So if anybody wants to, just go on to Mormon.org, and there's a button where you can chat with a Mormon missionary. And it's not chat as in they'll send the missionaries. It's like a live internet chat, like tech support. And I really recommend doing it because there's a lot of fun to be had there, apparently. Just watching these missionaries try and dig in their heels and try and fortify their very weak mental fortitude. And yeah, it's almost sad to see it happen, but I just enjoy it so much. They're missionaries. They put themselves there in that situation, and they're called to it. So they have to deal with the consequences of their decisions. So please, everybody else that wants to do that, please send those in. That was fantastic. Yes, please keep sending them in. Oh, looks like there was one more in my my messages inbox that I forgot to refer to. So it looks like Sarai also had a chat with Mormon missionaries. She just sent in a message. She didn't send in the actual transcript, but I took your challenge from an old episode while homesick today and jumped online to chat with a missionary. Thought I'd see what they had to say about your amazing find about the Comora's cave. What in the actual fuck? Yes, I agree. What in the actual fuck? They argued with me for a bit that it wasn't church-sanctioned material, stood by their claim of God taking the plates, and then ended suddenly with, quote, BYU and the Journal of Discourses are not church-approved sources. Thank you for visiting. End quote. The chat has ended. Of course, Sarai finishes, something tells me some missionary is going to have trouble sleeping tonight. Bravo. Thank you very much, Sarai. That was very well done. Anyway, so yeah, that was all of the chats that I could find. Anyway, yes, keep those up, though. Keep just pounding these poor missionaries into a state of utter cognitive dissonance and see if they'll emerge a more cynical and skeptical human being. We can only hope. I did have one quick email to address really briefly because it dovetails into the next part that I want to talk about. A person named Elliot sent in an email after they donated to the GoFundMe. I personally sent them a thank you for it. And then their reply says, thanks for getting back to me. I think this could really take off. With a 7-hour episode, you're giving Dan Carlin a run for his money. I wish I could never put stuff out as high of quality as Hardcore History, but thank you for the sentiment, at least. I appreciate that. Anyway, you joked about putting it behind a paywall, but Artie Lang is doing just that very successfully. Maybe this podcast landscape will change in the future in terms of monetizing. I'd pay $1 a show like Carlin asks. If there were an easy mechanism in iTunes to do so, I would do it. Who knows where things will go in 10 years. I like the roadshow idea too. You could pack venues because of your niche subject. The LDS faith has such a high rate of defection, especially now that big data is unraveling the Book of Mormon. Doing the numbers, you could make a tidy income too. Beats customer service, and you're so passionate about it. And it goes on a little bit after that, but that was the part that I wanted to address. As far as the content of the show goes, I just can't allow myself to put it behind a paywall. I want the information to be out there, and I want the show to survive on donation basis only. The reason I'm doing that model is just for the sheer sake of the nature of the information. I understand that there are podcasts that put their show behind a paywall or, extra content behind a paywall. And I get that. And that's a really, really good business model to do. But I can't, in good conscience, I can't lock this information up behind a wall. I want it to be openly and freely accessible for anybody that is interested in learning about Mormon history. And I don't want them to have to, try and seek out or feel like they're obligated to, pay money to like some membership site or something in order to gain access to the shows. I don't want them to feel like they have to torrent download the episodes or something like that. It's just ridiculous. So I understand what you're saying with that, Elliot. I understand that a lot of people are successfully putting podcasts behind a paywall, but with the nature of this content, I just can't bring myself to do it because more than I want to make money off of this, I want the information to be out there and available at cheap or free for anybody that's interested in it. So that being said, as far as doing the roadshow idea, once the Patreon goal hits the highest goal that it's at right now, that's kind of what I said is I'd like to go around, just drive around the country and meet up at ex-Mormon groups and, hang out with people and maybe do some live episodes from there. Well, I had the opportunity to do this, just very, very recently. And an episode that will be coming out soon was just me at an ex-Mormon hangout where I was able to gather a bunch of drunk ex-Mormons and talk to them about what broke their shelf and their experience in the church. And I mean, luckily enough, this first episode that is going to be released of these, it'll be labeled as its own special edition episode. It won't have the title special edition episode. It'll have something to the effect of like Exmo Hangout or something. But luckily, it was an all-female panel of ex-Mormons. So it was 4 ex-Mormon women talking about women's role in the church. And it was just such a fascinating subject. And that episode will be released here probably next month, here in January, come the new year. That being said, as far as these next couple episodes go, for this episode that's going to come out, this was just, of course, a special edition episode. And I have a lot going on for the next few weeks, and it's going to be really, really tough to turn out a full normal episode, the like historical timeline episode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split up the 7.5 hour episode into 3 separate episodes and release those all here within the next couple of weeks. That's been one of the primary requests with that 7.5 hour episode is it's just too big and cumbersome. It should be broken down into separate parts. And that's what I'll be doing. I'll break those down and put in bumpers at the beginning and end of it. So to provide some context about where the each given episode is going to take the conversation. And they're going to be, it's going to be basically just the same as the entire 7.5 hours, but it will be split up into much more palpable pieces, and it'll all still be the clean cut. So that's the plans for the next few weeks here. We'll jump back into the historical timeline sometime next, in the new year. For anybody listening back into the backlog, I guess it doesn't really matter to you, but for anybody that's caught up and listening to it right now, I apologize that it's going to take a while to get up to the next historical timeline episode, but that's just kind of the nature of how busy the holiday season is. So yeah, that's the plans for the next few episodes coming up. I did want to say I was on the most recent episode of the Flying Spaghetti Mormon podcast, episode 9, I believe it was. There will be a link to that in the show notes. That was a really fun, 2.5 hour discussion with a couple of other Exmos, just talking about some Mormon news topics. And, we really kind of rabbit trailed on quite a few drunken rants, but it was a lot of fun for me. And I think Ruben and Levi had a pretty good time as well. So I'd recommend checking that out. And also, at the time of recording this, I will be going on to the No Religion Required episode that will be airing on the 20th. It's a live show that goes up every week, every Sunday. And, I actually I met up with Bobby and Miss Ashley, the hosts of the show, at the 24-hour broadcast in Dallas. And that was an absolute party. I have to admit, that was the most fun I've ever had in just the whole podcasting world. That and ReasonCon were just so much fun. And it was great to meet old friends and to, reforge connections that had only been initially made in April at ReasonCon. And, David Michael was there and we hung out and we recorded an episode of the Doctrine and Covenants. And I think Joseph Smith was using his powers of prophecy, to know that we were going to be together recording that in the same place, because I think it was a personal record for D&C episodes of the drinking game. And of course, David and I were there sitting next to each other. So we couldn't get out from under any of the drinks, but I mean, it was ridiculous. ridiculous how many damn drinks were in that episode. So definitely check that out. I had a lot of fun doing that. Also, the 24-hour broadcast-a-thon has officially aired, and that was fantastic, spending the weekend in Dallas there. I hung out with Rachel Brown and Jason Camo. I hope you'll recognize Jason Camo as the producer of the music bumpers that are used in the show. And then, of course, Rachel Brown, she was on the anniversary episode as the paleoanthropologist, or I think, or she has some sort of fancy title, and she knows just shitloads about evolution. And she was a person we talked to about Book of Mormon archaeology and how there's absolutely nothing that supports it. And anyway, so I hung out with them for the first night, and then spending all 24 hours in Dogma Debate Studios and just having a good old time there. It was so much fun. We raised $1,569 in our hour, and that was, huge thanks to all the Exmos that were listening out for that and for donating during that hour, because we did, a lot better than I ever expected we would do. Of course, we didn't bring in, cognitive dissonance or scathing atheist money, but nobody expects that. They pulled in like $5,300 and $6,000 respectively. So, that's just, that's ridiculous. But anyway, the Exmo hour went fantastic. We talked about the Hans Mill massacre. Of course, David Michael was there with his son Roman, and Janie was there. It was just so much fun. So I recommend checking that out. It actually has a video as well. You get to see me in the Dogma Debate driver's seat. I actually was the host of the episode for that hour, and it was it was just so much fun. I'll leave links to that in the show notes as well. It was 24 hours and broken up into 3 separate chunks. I'll leave a link just for the one that had the Exmo hour in it, but I recommend checking all of it out. It's 24 hours of really, really good listening and a lot of good guests and fun conversation topics, and it was raising money to a good cause. They raised over $105,000 to help support the Secular Student Alliance. It was just phenomenal to see that much support go out to help, people that are in desperate need of this. The Secular Student Alliance is one of those organizations that's really helping people engage into a secular lifestyle while they're still, living in a religious home or wherever it may be. And they help create these clubs at schools where, especially highly religious schools in very religious areas. And it creates almost a safe haven for students that are feeling insecure at some level for, being not religious in a highly religious area. So the Secular Student Alliance, that's a foundation that we can all get behind. And, Exmos, I just want to thank you all so much for listening in during our hour and contributing during that time. We raised a pretty good chunk of money, and it was just such a delight being there in Dogma Debate Studios. I had so much fun. So, okay. All that being said, I think that's everything I needed to address to close out this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for contributing. Just to let everybody know, the GoFundMe hit its goal, and Friday was my last day working a day job. So now the GoFundMe is completely funded. I'm going to leave it up for the whole 6 months that I'm doing the whole book project. But everybody that contributed or contributes from now until that end of that 6 months gets a free copy of the books when they come out. And I just couldn't be more humbled and more grateful and thankful, and I couldn't possibly express more gratitude than how I'm feeling right now for everybody that is contributing so much to bring forward this work that I'm really, really putting a lot of time and effort and brain power into. I have all of you guys just to endlessly thank for everything. You guys are fantastic. You guys are really, really awesome. Thank you for funding the GoFundMe. I just could not be happier about this. So specifically, I did need to thank, we had Lori, Anonymous, Daryl, another Anonymous, Hal, good old Hal, I appreciate that, Brandon and Heather, Christy, another Anonymous, Kenny, Travis, Jeffrey, another Anonymous, and of course, once again, Zemu X Zenu Jr. All of these people donated dollar amounts to the GoFundMe page, and they all got it to completely funded. So in less than 1 month's time, the GoFundMe was completely funded. And like I said, I just can't express my gratitude enough. I have sent off personal thank you messages to everybody that has contributed to the GoFundMe. And I really want that to be, part of this. I want to have that personal connection with everybody that is donating. So just thank you everybody so much for doing so. Okay. That being said, that's everything for today's episode. To everybody listening that's caught up and listening in real time as opposed to in the backlog, happy Chris Mahana Kwanzaa, Merry Saturnalia, and Festivus for the rest of us, and happy winter solstice to everybody out there. I really hope you enjoy your holiday season, and I look forward to speaking to you guys all in the new year. Take care of yourselves and be safe and just be happy. Be good people and happy people like y'all are. I love y'all so much. Before finishing up today, I need to thank a few people. Thanks to No Illusions and Lucinda Illusions for offering their voice for the new intro for the episode. If you'd like to have your voice featured in the intro and your blog or podcast or group plugged in the show notes, you can find the script on the website. Simply email an MP3 of you saying those clips and it will be included in the show, just like Noah and Lucinda Illusions. Thank you to all the patrons who support the show. If you'd like to be as awesome as them, you can go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to sign up to make a per episode donation. If you can't afford a couple bucks a month, you can always help out the show a bunch by going on iTunes or Stitcher or your podcast app of choice and leave a 5-star review for the show. It'll only cost a couple of minutes instead of a couple bucks. Thank you to everybody that shares the show through Facebook, Twitter, and other social medias. If you want to get in touch with me directly, email nakedmormonism@gmail.com and I'll try to answer your questions during the next listener mail segment. Check out the show notes and a lot more information about the show on nakedmormonismpodcast.com. And thanks to Demonista for working so hard on the Facebook page that stays rich and fresh with content and lots of exciting conversation. Thanks to Jason Camo for his talent and musical creation that is used in the show with permission. For more of his amazing musical stylings, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. From me, Bryce Blankenagel, I would like to especially thank you, the listener, for lending me your ear. I'll have to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.